If you found yourself here tonight, welcome. Maybe it's been a long day, filled with noise, with people, with things that just wouldn't slow down. Or maybe it's your quiet evening, and you're simply looking for something soft to ease your thoughts. Perhaps you're a student, your mind still tangled in notes, names, and dates. Or maybe you're just lying there in the dark, hoping that sleep will come gently tonight. Whatever the reason, I'm really glad you came. Right now, there sits nothing you need to do. Let your hands rest. Let your breath grow slower, deeper. Let your shoulders sink into the bed, just a little more. You sit safe here. And you stir not alone. My only role tonight is to be with you, to speak softly while your mind begins to wander, and to take you far away from the stress of the present, into one of the strangest chapters in military history. Tonight we go back to the year 1788, to the Carpathian foothills, where the Austrian Imperial Army has made camp, their white canvas tents scattered like pearls across the landscape, as the cool September air settles over the hills. Soldiers from all corners of the empire lie resting. Some speak German, others Hungarian, others languages unfamiliar, even to their own commanders. They still all come to fight the Ottoman Empire. But on this night, there would be no battle with the enemy. Instead, something unthinkable would unfold. This is the story of the Battle of Karansebes, where miscommunication turned into panic, and panic turned into chaos, until an entire army turned on itself. No enemy in sight. No enemy needed. But don't worry, I'll tell you everything slowly and calmly. All you need to do is listen. Let the past drift in like a quiet breeze. Let your imagination wander through torchlit tents and confused voices in the night. And if this gentle story helps you relax, if these calm journeys through forgotten moments bring you peace, feel free to leave a like or subscribe. That way, I can be here again tomorrow night, to share another soft-spoken step through time, and keep you company, one peaceful evening at a time. Sleep well. Chapter 1. Camp Rumors and Schnapps. The Gathering Storm. The sun dips below the horizon on September 17, 1788, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The Austrian Imperial Army has established its encampment on the banks of the Timinch River, near the fortress town of Karansebes. The location is strategic, a crossing point that must be held against any Ottoman advance from the south. Yet tonight, the greatest threat will come not from across the river, but from within the camp itself. Picture yourself walking through this military encampment as twilight deepens. The air carries the familiar scents of a field army, wood smoke from countless cooking fires, the earthy smell of horses and leather, the sharper tang of gunpowder and metal. Soldiers move about their evening routines with practiced efficiency, some tending to their muskets, others preparing simple meals of bread and soup. The steady rhythm of camp life continues, but beneath the surface, tension simmers. This is not a unified force in the way we might imagine a modern army. The Austrian Imperial Army of 1788 is a patchwork of regiments drawn from across the vast Habsburg territories. German-speaking officers from Austria proper command companies of Hungarian hussars, their bright uniforms and distinctive braided jackets marking them as elite cavalry. Croatian border guards, hardened by years of frontier warfare, keep watch alongside Italian artillery specialists from the northern provinces. Wallachian irregulars, recruited from the local population, serve as scouts and guides through the unfamiliar terrain. The challenges of commanding such a diverse force are immense. Orders must be translated through multiple languages: German, Hungarian, Croatian, Italian, Romanian. A simple command to advance might pass through 3 interpreters before reaching the common soldier. Cultural misunderstandings are frequent. Religious differences add another layer of complexity, as Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant soldiers attempt to find common ground in their shared military service. To truly understand what unfolds this night, one must appreciate the burden these men carry. The campaign season of 1788 has been particularly grueling, marking the second year of what would become known as the Austro-Turkish War. The conflict began with such promise. Emperor Joseph II himself had taken the field, determined to push Ottoman power back from the Danube and secure the southern frontiers of his realm forever. But war in the Balkans is never simple. The landscape itself seems designed to frustrate military operations: endless forests, where armies can disappear, rivers that flood without warning, mountain passes that become death traps for unwary commanders. The Ottomans, fighting on familiar ground with the desperate courage of men defending their homes, have proven far more resilient than Habsburg planners had anticipated. The men gathered around Karansabes bear the psychological scars of this difficult campaign. At Shabak, Austrian forces had achieved a stunning initial victory, storming the fortress and sending Ottoman defenders fleeing across the Save River. The triumph had seemed to vindicate the emperor's strategy, and for a brief moment it appeared that the path to Belgrade lay open. But success in one battle does not guarantee victory in a war. The Ottoman response had been swift and savage. Reinforcements poured in from across the empire, seasoned janissaries from the Anatolian garrisons, fierce Tatar horsemen from the steppes, Albanian irregulars who knew every hidden path through the mountainous terrain. The Austrian advance, so promising in its opening phase, had ground to a halt in the face of determined resistance. Captain Friedrich von Mannheim, a Saxon officer, serving with the 3rd Infantry Regiment, keeps a detailed journal of the campaign that provides insight into the growing frustration of the Austrian forces. His entries from early September reveal an army increasingly plagued by supply problems, disease, and the constant stress of operating in hostile territory. The men grow thin on short rations. Von Mannheim writes on September 10th, while our horses suffer from the poor quality of local forage. Each day brings new reports of Turkish movements, yet when our patrols investigate, they find only empty villages and cold campfires. It is as if we fight ghosts who vanish at our approach, only to reappear behind our lines. The psychological warfare employed by Ottoman forces proves particularly effective against the multinational Austrian army. Turkish irregulars, moving with intimate knowledge of local terrain, conduct constant raids against Austrian supply lines. They strike without warning, disappearing before significant forces can be brought to bear against them. The effect on Austrian morale is devastating. No position feels secure, no road seems safe. The diversity that theoretically gives the Austrian army its strength becomes a source of weakness under the stress of extended campaign. Lieutenant Joseph Takux, a Hungarian officer serving with the Sekli border guards, observes in his letters home how the different nationalities within the army respond differently to the pressures of warfare. The German-speaking troops, raised in the heartland of the Habsburg monarchy, approach the campaign with methodical precision but limited flexibility. They excel at formal battles and siege operations, but struggle with the irregular warfare that characterizes the Balkan front. Their training emphasizes discipline and obedience, qualities that serve them well in conventional operations, but prove less valuable when confronting an enemy that refuses to fight by European rules. The Hungarian cavalry, by contrast, seems naturally suited to the fluid nature of Balkan warfare. Their traditional fighting methods, developed through centuries of conflict with Ottoman raiders, prove highly effective in the current environment. Hungarian hussars excel at reconnaissance, pursuit, and the kind of rapid movement that can turn a local advantage into a significant victory. But this very effectiveness creates tension within the army's command structure. Hungarian officers, conscious of their unit's superior performance in the current theatre, grow increasingly frustrated with what they perceive as the rigid thinking of their German-speaking superiors. Why, they ask, should Hungarian tactics be subordinated to Austrian methods that have proven inadequate to local conditions? The Croat border guards represent yet another military tradition within the Habsburg forces. These men, raised on the military frontier where constant warfare with Ottoman raiders has been a way of life for generations, possess an understanding of irregular warfare that surpasses even that of the Hungarians. Their knowledge of Turkish fighting methods, their familiarity with Balkan terrain, and their personal investment in defending their homeland make them invaluable assets. Yet the Croats also prove difficult to integrate into conventional military operations. Their concept of discipline differs markedly from that of regular troops, and their tendency to pursue personal vendettas against Turkish forces sometimes conflicts with broader strategic objectives. Croatian officers complain that their intimate knowledge of the enemy is consistently undervalued by headquarters staff, who prefer theoretical knowledge to practical experience. The Italian troops, primarily artillery specialists and engineers from the northern provinces, bring technical expertise that proves crucial in siege operations. Their mathematical training and understanding of ballistics make them invaluable for reducing Turkish fortifications, but they struggle with the physical demands of Balkan campaigning, and often find themselves at odds with the more martial cultures represented elsewhere in the army. These cultural tensions are exacerbated by the army's supply situation. Different national groups within the Habsburg forces maintain distinct dietary traditions and religious observances that complicate logistics. Hungarian cavalry require different equipment from German infantry, while Croatian border guards expect forms of compensation that regular troops do not receive. As evening settles over the camp at Karansabes, these underlying tensions reach a critical point. The day has been particularly trying. Reports of Turkish forces in the vicinity have kept the army on high alert, while a shortage of fresh bread has forced many units to subsist on hardtack and whatever local provisions they can purchase or forage. The camp itself reflects the army's multinational character. Each national group has established its own section, complete with distinctive cooking fires, different styles of tent arrangement, and the particular sounds of their native languages. The German-speaking troops maintain rigid order in their section, with straight rows of tents and precisely measured spacing between campfires. The Hungarian cavalry area displays more apparent chaos, but operates according to its own internal logic, with horses picketed near their riders and equipment arranged for rapid deployment. The Croatian sector seems almost like a separate military establishment, with scouts coming and going at all hours, and an atmosphere of constant readiness for immediate action. The irregulars who serve with the Croats, local guides, refugees from Turkish territory, and various adventurers attracted by the prospect of plunder, give this area a distinctly civilian character that regular officers find disturbing. Into this complex environment come the Wallachian merchants who will unwittingly trigger the night's catastrophe. These civilian entrepreneurs, following the army as it moves through their territory, represent a vital link between the military forces and the local economy. They provide goods that the official supply system cannot deliver: fresh food, alcohol, tobacco, and various luxury items that make campaign life bearable. Among these merchants is Gheorghe Popescu, a man in his 40s who has made a comfortable living by anticipating the needs of soldiers far from home. His small convoy of pack animals carries carefully selected goods chosen for their appeal to different national groups within the Austrian army. German sausages for the Austrian infantry, Hungarian paprika for the cavalry, Italian wine for the artillery officers. Popescu understands that successful commerce with military forces requires cultural sensitivity. But tonight, Popescu carries something even more valuable than his usual trade goods. Through connections in the local nobility, he has acquired several bottles of exceptional schnapps, distilled according to traditional Hungarian methods and aged to perfection. Such luxury items command premium prices from soldiers whose pay is often months in arrears, and Popescu knows that the Hungarian cavalry, with their recent success in capturing Turkish supply wagons, will have coin to spend. As darkness falls, groups of soldiers gather around their fires, sharing stories and rumors. The campaign against the Ottomans has been challenging, with mixed successes and frustrating setbacks. The men are tired, far from home, and increasingly nervous about Turkish forces that seem to appear and disappear like shadows in the night. Every rustle in the darkness, every unexpected sound, sets nerves on edge. Near the edge of the camp, a small group of Hungarian cavalry scouts prepares for their evening patrol. These men, with their distinctive braided dolmans and curved sabers, represent some of the finest light cavalry in Europe. They have been ranging far ahead of the main army, probing for signs of Ottoman movement. Tonight, their leader, a seasoned sergeant named Janusz Kovacs, has allowed his men a brief respite before they venture into the darkness beyond the camp perimeter. Sergeant Kovacs exemplifies the professional Hungarian cavalry officer of the 18th century. Born in a small village near Debrecen, he had joined the army as a common trooper 15 years earlier, rising through the ranks through a combination of natural ability, fierce courage, and the kind of tactical sense that cannot be taught in any military academy. His men trust him implicitly, knowing that his decisions are based on hard-won experience rather than theoretical knowledge. The scouts have discovered something that lifts their spirits. Popescu and his associates have managed to position themselves near the Hungarian sector, their pack animals loaded with goods that promise relief from the monotony of campaign rations. The Schnapps in particular represents exactly the kind of comfort that tired soldiers crave after weeks of poor food and constant tension. The transaction begins amicably enough. Popescu, wise in the ways of soldiers, knows that a fair price paid with good humor will earn him protection and future business. The Schnapps flows freely, passed from hand to hand in the time-honored tradition of soldiers sharing their fortune. Stories are exchanged in broken German and Hungarian, punctuated by laughter and the occasional toast to the emperor's health. Trooper Peter Sabo, a young cavalryman from Pest, finds himself relaxing for the first time in weeks as the warmth of the alcohol spreads through his tired body. He shares stories of his family's vineyard with Popescu, who responds with tales of his own travels through the Wallachian countryside. For a brief moment, the war seems distant, replaced by the simple human pleasure of shared companionship. But armies are complex social systems, and the presence of alcohol in such an environment can quickly transform celebration into conflict. Word of the Schnapps spreads through the camp with remarkable speed, carried by the informal networks of friendship and mutual obligation that bind military units together. Soon, soldiers from other units begin to drift toward the gathering, drawn by the promise of warmth and camaraderie. The first to arrive are other Hungarian troops, infantrymen from the border regiments, who share language and cultural bonds with the cavalry. Their integration into the gathering proceeds smoothly, with the easy fellowship that exists between men who fight under the same national colors. The Schnapps continues to flow, and the circle of participants expands without tension. The arrival of German-speaking infantry from Lower Austria changes the dynamics entirely. These men, their heavy boots and practical uniforms, contrasting sharply with the elaborate dress of the Hungarian cavalry, represent a different military tradition and a different relationship to the current campaign. Private Franz Weber, a blacksmith's son from Vienna, approaches the group with the mixture of curiosity and entitlement that characterizes soldiers seeking to share in their comrades' good fortune. The Austrian infantrymen, foot soldiers who have marched hundreds of miles through mud and dust, view the mounted Hungarians with a mixture of admiration and resentment. The cavalry, with their horses and higher pay, their colorful uniforms and romantic reputation, seem to live in a different world from the common foot soldier. When they see the Hungarians enjoying their schnapps with the merchants, old grievances begin to surface. Weber's request for a share of the liquor is initially polite, couched in the formal courtesy that military regulation requires between soldiers of different nationalities. But when Sergeant Kovacs explains that the schnapps has been purchased with Hungarian money and that supplies are limited, Weber's response reveals the deeper tensions that have been building throughout the campaign. Typical Hungarian arrogance, Weber mutters in German to his companions, his voice loud enough to be heard by the Magyar speakers. They think they're better than honest German soldiers. The comment, while spoken in a language that many of the Hungarians do not understand, carries a tone that transcends linguistic barriers. The situation deteriorates rapidly as cultural misunderstandings amplify personal grievances. Corporal Istvan Nagy, a veteran Hungarian cavalryman with scars from a dozen engagements, takes offense not just at Weber's words, but at the implications behind them. In Magyar, he responds with equal heat. Let the foot sloggers buy their own drink if they want to taste quality spirits. The language barrier, which has been a constant source of friction throughout the campaign, now becomes an accelerant for conflict. Neither side can fully understand what the other is saying, but both sides recognize hostility when they hear it. Gestures and tone carry meaning across linguistic boundaries, and both groups find themselves increasingly defensive about their national honor. Sergeant Kovacs attempts to maintain order, but his authority extends only to his own men. The Austrian infantry have their own sergeants, their own traditions, their own sense of justice. Sergeant Klaus Hoffmann, a veteran of the 7 Years' War, who has spent his entire adult life in the Habsburg service, finds himself caught between his duty to maintain discipline and his sympathy for his men's grievances. Hoffmann understands the frustrations that drive his soldiers. The Austrian infantry have borne the brunt of the campaign's hardships: long marches, short rations, and the constant danger of Turkish raids. Meanwhile, the cavalry seems to enjoy preferential treatment in everything from quarters to provisions to opportunities for glory. The sight of Hungarian troopers enjoying luxury items while Austrian foot soldiers go without strikes him as emblematic of larger inequities within the army. As voices rise and tempers flare, the careful discipline that holds an army together begins to fray. The merchants, sensing danger, attempt to withdraw their remaining bottles, but they are caught between the two groups of increasingly hostile soldiers. Popescu, his commercial instincts warring with his desire for self-preservation, makes the fatal decision to attempt to defuse the situation by offering to sell additional bottles to the Austrian troops. But the offer comes too late, and on terms that the Austrians find insulting. The price quoted for the remaining Schnapps is significantly higher than what the Hungarians had paid, reflecting both the increased demand and Popescu's assessment of the risks involved in the transaction. Weber and his companions interpret this price differential as evidence of a conspiracy between the merchants and the Hungarian cavalry to exclude German-speaking soldiers from fair treatment. The first physical contact comes when Weber reaches for one of the bottles being offered to his group, only to have his hand slapped away by Trooper Sabor, who claims that the Hungarians have already paid for that particular bottle. The slap, while relatively minor in physical terms, carries enormous symbolic weight. In the hierarchical world of military service, such an action represents a fundamental challenge to established order. Weber's response is immediate and violent. His fist connects with Sabor's jaw with a sound that carries clearly across the camp. The young Hungarian trooper, caught off balance by both the alcohol and the surprise of the attack, stumbles backward into his sergeant. Within moments, what had been a negotiation becomes a brawl, with participants from both sides throwing punches in the flickering light of the campfires. The fight spreads outward like ripples in a pond, encompassing more and more men as the night deepens. The sound of combat, shouts in multiple languages, the crack of breaking bottles, the thud of bodies hitting the ground, carries across the camp with the clarity that only comes in the still night air. Soldiers throughout the encampment stop their evening activities to listen, trying to determine the source and significance of the disturbance. In the Croatian sector, Captain Marko Jurisic hears the commotion and immediately orders his men to weapons. The Croats, veterans of countless skirmishes along the Ottoman border, recognize the sounds of violence and assume that Turkish infiltrators have penetrated the camp's defenses. Their response is swift and professional. Sentries are doubled, weapons are loaded, and scout parties prepare to investigate the disturbance. Similar reactions occur throughout the camp as different units respond according to their training and cultural expectations. The Italian artillery crews, concerned about the security of their valuable guns, begin moving their weapons to more defensible positions. The German infantry, drilled in the formal procedures of 18th century warfare, await orders from their officers while maintaining strict discipline within their own ranks. But the Hungarian and Austrian troops, directly involved in the brawl, operate under no such restraints. The fight has taken on a life of its own, fueled by alcohol, national pride, and the accumulated frustrations of a difficult campaign. Friends rush to support friends, without understanding the original cause of the dispute, naturally siding with their own units and their own countrymen. Lieutenant Takars, the Hungarian officer, whose letters provide such valuable insight into the campaign, arrives at the scene of the fight just as it reaches its most chaotic phase. His attempt to restore order is hampered by the darkness, the language barriers, and the simple fact that many of the participants are too drunk or too angry to listen to reason. His shouts in Hungarian carry authority with his own men, but mean nothing to the Austrian infantrymen, who see only another enemy officer attempting to interfere with their legitimate grievances. The situation becomes even more confused with the arrival of Wallachian irregulars, local men who serve as guides and interpreters for the Austrian forces. These fighters, familiar with the brutal realities of Balkan warfare, interpret the sounds of combat as evidence of a Turkish night attack. Their response is immediate and violent. They begin firing their weapons at any figure they cannot clearly identify as friendly. The irregular troops, while valuable for their local knowledge and fighting skills, lack the discipline and training of regular soldiers. Their weapons are often poorly maintained, their powder charges inconsistent, and their marksmanship questionable. But in the darkness and confusion of the camp, even poorly aimed shots can have devastating consequences. It is one of these Wallachian irregulars, a young man named Constantin Dinu, whose village had been burned by Turkish raiders earlier in the campaign, who fires the shot that transforms everything. Seeing figures struggling in the darkness and hearing shouts in languages he cannot understand, Dinu assumes that the camp is under attack. His musket, loaded with a heavy charge intended for use against Turkish cavalry, discharges with a flash and roar that can be heard throughout the encampment. The single musket shot rings out across the camp, sharp and clear in the night air, whether fired intentionally or by accident, whether meant as a warning or a weapon. That shot changes everything. In an instant, the atmosphere shifts from disorder to terror. The sound of gunfire in a military camp can mean only one thing: the enemy has arrived. The psychological effect of that single shot cannot be overstated. For weeks, the Austrian army has been on edge. constantly expecting Turkish attacks that materialize like phantoms in the night. Every sentinel has been warned to expect infiltration attempts. Every patrol has been briefed on Ottoman tactics. The sound of gunfire transforms a simple brawl between drunk soldiers into confirmation of their worst fears. The word spreads faster than the wind. Turks. The Turks are in the camp. The cry is taken up in German, Hungarian, Italian and Croatian, each language adding its own nuance of terror to the basic message. Soldiers who moments before were engaged in a simple fistfight now believe they are fighting for their lives against Ottoman infiltrators. Captain von Mannheim, roused from his tent by the sound of gunfire, emerges into a scene of absolute chaos. His trained military mind attempts to assess the tactical situation, but the darkness makes it impossible to distinguish friend from foe, unit from unit. The dancing shadows cast by campfires create an environment where every moving figure might be an enemy, where every unfamiliar uniform might belong to a Turkish spy. The captain's attempts to rally his men are hampered by the babble of languages that characterizes the Habsburg army. His orders in German are misunderstood by Hungarian troopers, while his attempts to communicate with Croatian scouts are frustrated by the dialect differences that separate military German from the languages of the frontier. In the growing pandemonium, as men rush to their weapons and officers shout contradictory commands, any semblance of military order begins to collapse. The darkness, which had hidden the details of the original dispute, now conceals what everyone believes to be a deadly enemy advance. Shadows become Turkish janissaries. The sound of running feet becomes the advance of Ottoman cavalry. The shouts of confused soldiers become the war cries of attacking Muslims. Fear, once unleashed in such an environment, feeds upon itself until it becomes an unstoppable force. Private Weber, his face bloody from the original fight with the Hungarian troopers, staggers through the camp convinced that he has been fighting Turkish infiltrators rather than fellow Habsburg soldiers. His incoherent reports to anyone who will listen describe savage Muslim warriors who have penetrated deep into the Austrian lines. Each retelling of his story adds new details, new horrors, new reasons for panic. The response of different units to the perceived crisis reveals the fundamental problems that have plagued the Austrian army throughout the campaign. The German-speaking troops, trained in the formal tactics of European warfare, attempt to form defensive squares against what they believe to be a cavalry charge, but their movements in the darkness are clumsy and uncertain, and their officers struggle to maintain control over men who can barely see beyond the reach of their own muskets. The Hungarian cavalry, more accustomed to irregular warfare, scatter to avoid what they perceive as aimed fire from concealed Turkish positions. Their training and instincts, perfectly suited for fighting Ottoman irregulars in daylight, prove counterproductive in the current situation. Their rapid movement through the camp creates additional confusion, as other units mistake Hungarian troopers for attacking Turks. Captain Jurisic and his Croatian border guards respond with the deadly efficiency of men who have spent their lives fighting Turks. They advance in small groups toward the sound of gunfire, their weapons ready and their movements coordinated by whispered commands in their native language. But their very competence becomes a liability in the current situation, as other Austrian units mistake their professional approach for evidence of enemy infiltration. The Italian artillery crews face a particularly complex situation. Their guns, designed for siege warfare and open-field battles, are poorly suited for close-quarters combat in a confined camp, but the psychological impact of artillery fire might help restore order if only they could determine where to aim their weapons. Lieutenant Giacomo Bertolini, commanding a battery of 6-pounders, finds himself paralyzed by the impossibility of distinguishing targets in the chaos around him. Meanwhile, the Wallachian irregulars, convinced that their quick action has alerted the camp to a Turkish attack, begin hunting for additional infiltrators. Their familiarity with Turkish tactics leads them to expect attacks from multiple directions, and they interpret every movement in the darkness as evidence of enemy activity. Their sporadic gunfire, intended to suppress Turkish advances, instead convinces other units that the attack is more widespread than initially believed. The camp's defensive arrangements, carefully planned for dealing with external threats, prove wholly inadequate for managing internal chaos. Sentries posted around the perimeter find themselves shooting at figures emerging from within the camp, unable to distinguish between fleeing soldiers and advancing enemies. The watchwords and countersigns that should identify friendly forces become useless when shouted in the wrong language or forgotten in the heat of panic. As the night progresses, the situation deteriorates with frightening speed. Units that had maintained discipline in the face of months of difficult campaigning collapse within minutes when confronted with an enemy they cannot see or understand. The careful military machine that Emperor Joseph II had assembled for his Turkish wars transforms itself into an instrument of self-destruction. Colonel Franz von Colloredo, the senior officer present in the camp, attempts to restore order through a series of increasingly desperate measures. His staff officers, mounted on horseback and carrying torches, ride through the camp shouting commands and attempting to rally scattered units. But their very presence, silhouetted against the flames and moving rapidly through the darkness, convinces many soldiers that Turkish cavalry have indeed penetrated the camp's defenses. The regimental bands, those musical units that normally provide entertainment and communication during daylight operations, attempt to restore order by playing familiar tunes that might rally their scattered comrades. But in the current chaos, even music becomes a source of confusion. The stirring strains of Gotter Halte Franz den Kaiser mix with Hungarian folk melodies and Croatian war songs, creating a cacophony that adds to rather than reduces the general disorder. Communication between different parts of the camp becomes virtually impossible, as runners carrying messages are mistaken for enemy agents and fired upon by their own comrades. Written orders prove useless when officers cannot read them in the darkness, or when the recipients speak different languages from the senders. The elaborate staff procedures that govern military operations in peacetime become obstacles to effective action in the current crisis. The Austrian army, trained and equipped for conventional warfare against European enemies, finds itself completely unprepared for the psychological warfare that now grips the camp. Soldiers who would stand firm against Turkish charges in daylight flee in panic from shadows that might conceal Ottoman assassins. Officers who could maneuver thousands of men across complex battlefields find themselves unable to control their own immediate subordinates. As individual units lose cohesion and scatter through the camp, they encounter other equally confused and frightened groups. These meetings, which should result in mutual recognition and coordinated action, instead become additional combat engagements, as each group assumes that the other consists of disguised enemies. The Habsburg uniform, normally a symbol of unity and shared purpose, becomes meaningless in the darkness where every figure appears threatening. The personal tragedies that unfold during the night reveal the human dimension of military catastrophe. Sergeant Kovacs, the experienced Hungarian cavalryman whose unit had originally purchased the Schnapps, finds himself separated from his men and wandering through a camp that has become utterly foreign to him. His attempts to identify himself to other Austrian troops are frustrated by the language barrier and by the general assumption that anyone moving through the darkness must be an enemy. When Kovacs encounters a group of terrified Austrian infantrymen, his Hungarian uniform and his attempts to communicate in Magyar convince them that he is a Turkish spy attempting to gather intelligence about their positions. Despite his protests and his obvious European features, he is shot down by men who genuinely believe they are defending their camp against Ottoman infiltrators. Similar scenes play out throughout the night, as the bonds of military brotherhood dissolve under the pressure of fear and confusion. Croatian border guards, mistaken for Turkish irregulars because of their non-standard uniforms and their unfamiliar language, find themselves under fire from artillery crews who cannot distinguish between allies and enemies. Italian engineers, attempting to secure their technical equipment, are attacked by Hungarian cavalry who assume that anyone near the guns must be a Turkish saboteur. The Wallachian merchants who had originally triggered the conflict find themselves caught in a nightmare that exceeds their worst fears about the dangers of following an army in wartime. Popescu, his pack animals laden with goods that now seem utterly insignificant, attempts to lead his small convoy to safety only to discover that every path through the camp has become a battlefield, where the opposing sides consist entirely of Austrian soldiers shooting at each other. The fate of individual soldiers becomes a matter of chance rather than skill or courage. A young Austrian private named Johann Steiner survives the night by falling into a latrine pit and remaining hidden until dawn, while his sergeant, a veteran of multiple campaigns, is killed by friendly fire while attempting to rally his scattered company. The random nature of survival in such chaotic conditions makes heroes of cowards and victims of the brave. The medical personnel attached to the army find themselves overwhelmed by casualties that result not from enemy action but from the army's attack upon itself. Anton Müller, the chief surgeon of the 3rd Infantry Regiment, attempts to establish aid stations for the wounded, but discovers that his efforts are hampered by continued fighting around every potential medical facility. The wounded themselves become sources of additional confusion, as their cries for help in various languages are misinterpreted as signals between enemy forces. As dawn breaks over the camp at Karansabez, the full extent of the catastrophe becomes apparent. The Austrian Imperial Army, one of Europe's premier military forces, has effectively destroyed itself in a single night of self-inflicted violence. Hundreds of soldiers lie dead or wounded, shot down not by Turkish bullets, but by the weapons of their own comrades. Equipment worth thousands of florins has been destroyed or abandoned, as units fled from imaginary enemies. The campsite itself bears witness to the night's chaos. Tents have been trampled or burned, supply wagons overturned or riddled with musket balls, horses scattered or killed in the crossfire. The careful organization that characterizes a professional military encampment has been replaced by a scene of devastation that suggests the aftermath of a major battle, which, in a sense, it is. Colonel von Kalerdo, surveying the wreckage of his command, faces the impossible task of explaining to his superiors how an elite army managed to defeat itself without any enemy intervention. His preliminary reports, necessarily incomplete given the scale of the disaster, attempt to describe events that seem to defy rational explanation. How does one tell the emperor that his forces have suffered a crushing defeat at their own hands? The survivors of the night's fighting struggle to comprehend what has happened to them. Many retain vivid memories of combat with Turkish forces, of desperate fights against Ottoman infiltrators, of heroic resistance against overwhelming odds. The revelation that their enemies had been fellow Habsburg soldiers, their own comrades in arms, proves almost impossible to accept. Some soldiers simply refuse to believe the evidence of daylight, maintaining that Turkish forces had indeed attacked the camp and that the current explanations represent some form of elaborate deception. Others, confronted with the undeniable reality of what has occurred, suffer psychological breaks that will plague them for the remainder of their military service. The trauma of having killed one's own comrades proves more devastating than any wound inflicted by an actual enemy. The Battle of Karansabez stands as perhaps the most dramatic example of how quickly military discipline can collapse when fear and confusion take hold. The engagement demonstrates the fundamental importance of communication, coordination, and mutual trust in military operations. When these elements fail, even the finest armies can become their own worst enemies. The multinational character of the Habsburg forces, normally a source of strength through diversity, becomes a critical weakness when effective communication becomes impossible. The language barriers that were manageable in normal operations prove catastrophic when rapid, clear communication becomes essential for survival. The cultural misunderstandings that were minor irritants during peacetime become deadly conflicts when amplified by fear and alcohol. The incident also reveals the psychological fragility that underlies all military organizations. Soldiers who are trained to respond instantly to perceived threats can become deadly when those threats are misidentified. The very reflexes that make men effective warriors can turn them into instruments of destruction when pointed in the wrong direction. In the aftermath of the disaster, Austrian military authorities attempted to suppress knowledge of what had occurred, recognizing that news of such an incident could undermine confidence in Habsburg military capabilities throughout Europe. Official reports described the casualties as resulting from an unfortunate encounter with Turkish forces, while survivors were discouraged from discussing the true events of that night. But military disasters of such magnitude cannot be hidden indefinitely. Word of the Battle of Karansabez gradually spread through the informal networks that connect military establishments across Europe, becoming a cautionary tale about the dangers of poor communication and inadequate leadership. The incident entered military folklore as an example of how armies can defeat themselves more thoroughly than any enemy ever could. The events at Karansabez provide enduring lessons about the nature of military organization and the factors that contribute to military effectiveness. The incident demonstrates that technical proficiency, individual courage, and superior equipment mean nothing when basic military virtues like communication and coordination break down. The disaster also highlights the importance of cultural sensitivity and linguistic competence in multinational military operations. The Habsburg army's attempt to create unity through imposed uniformity proved inadequate when confronted with the real diversity of its component elements. The failure to develop effective systems for cross-cultural communication within the army created vulnerabilities that proved catastrophic when exploited by circumstances. Perhaps most importantly, The Battle of Karansabes illustrates how small incidents can cascade into large disasters when proper safeguards are not in place. The original dispute over Schnapps, trivial in itself, grew into a catastrophe because the military system lacked effective mechanisms for preventing and controlling internal conflicts. The army's focus on external threats blinded it to the internal vulnerabilities that proved far more dangerous. The night of September 17, 1788, thus stands as a monument to military hubris and a reminder that an army's greatest enemy may be itself. In the growing pandemonium of that terrible night, as men rushed to their weapons and officers shouted contradictory commands, the Austrian imperial army demonstrated that the line between order and chaos, between discipline and disaster, can be crossed in an instant. The Battle of Karansabes had begun, and the enemy was themselves. Chapter 2: Panic in the Night. When fear becomes contagion. The single musket shot that pierced the September night air at Karansabes would echo through military history as the spark that ignited one of warfare's most bizarre tragedies. In the immediate aftermath of that sharp crack, time seemed suspended, a heartbeat of silence before the camp erupted into chaos. Picture yourself in that moment of terrible stillness, when the last echoes of gunfire fade into the darkness and every soldier holds his breath, waiting for what comes next. The reaction, when it comes, is instantaneous and devastating. A voice cuts through the night air, high-pitched with terror. "Terci, Terci, 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 Terci." The cry comes from one of the Wallachian irregulars, a man whose family has lived for generations on the fluid frontier between Christian and Ottoman lands. To him, the sound of unexpected gunfire can mean only one thing: the enemy has infiltrated the camp under cover of darkness. The word spreads through the encampment like wildfire consuming dry grass. "Turks!" The cry is taken up by other voices, translated into German as Turken and Hungarian as Törökök. Each repetition carries more urgency, more terror. In the darkness, where shadows can hide any number of enemies, the imagination fills in what the eyes cannot see. Every tent becomes a potential hiding place, every figure a possible assassin. Imagine yourself as one of these soldiers, awakened from sleep by the sound of gunfire and shouting. You emerge from your tent into a world transformed. The familiar camp of moments before has become an alien landscape of threat and confusion. Comrades who were sharing stories around the fire are now running in every direction, their faces pale with fear in the flickering light. The ordered rows of tents, the careful military precision of the encampment, dissolve into chaos as men stumble over guy ropes and collide with supply wagons in their haste to find weapons and formation. The officers, trained to maintain discipline in the face of enemy attack, respond with practiced authority. German-speaking commanders emerge from their quarters, shouting orders to form ranks and prepare for battle, but their commands, delivered in the crisp tones of Prussian military tradition, create new layers of confusion among the diverse troops. "Halt, halt," they cry, using the standard German military command to stop and form ranks. To German-speaking soldiers, the command is clear and familiar, but to the Hungarian cavalrymen, still reeling from their earlier confrontation, the sharp German syllables sound different in the darkness. To the Wallachian irregulars, whose ears are attuned to the sounds of Ottoman Turkish from years of border warfare, the repeated cry of "halt, halt" becomes something else entirely. In their terror and confusion, they hear "Allah, Allah," the sacred name that Ottoman soldiers invoke as they charge into battle. Major Wilhelm von Preysing, a Bavarian officer commanding the 2nd Battalion of the Deutschmeister Regiment, exemplifies the impossible position faced by field commanders during this crisis. Awakened by the sound of gunfire, his first instinct is to secure his sector and prepare for battle. His orderly, a young corporal named Andreas Huber, rushes to his tent with reports that are both alarming and contradictory. "Sir," Huber gasps, his breath visible in the cool night air. "There's fighting throughout the camp. The sentries report movement on all sides, and the Wallachians are screaming about Turks, but I can't see any enemy forces, only our own men running in every direction." Preysing's military experience, gained through years of service in the 7 Years' War, tells him that something is fundamentally wrong with this situation. Ottoman night attacks, while certainly possible, typically follow predictable patterns. The Turks excel at infiltration and surprise, but they rely on speed and coordination to achieve their objectives. What he observes through his tent flap, scattered groups of soldiers moving without apparent purpose, sporadic gunfire with no concentrated volleys, suggests something other than an organized enemy assault. But military protocol demands action in the face of apparent enemy contact. Praising orders his drummers to beat the alarm, hoping to rally his scattered companies and establish some semblance of control over his sector. The drum beats, echoing across the camp, should serve as a beacon for his men and a signal to other battalion commanders that the Deutschmeister regiment remains operational. Instead, the drums add to the growing cacophony of military signals that no longer convey meaningful information. Different regiments use different drum calls, and in the darkness, soldiers cannot determine which signals apply to their units. A Croatian border guard, hearing the Deutschmeister drums, interprets the rhythm as a Turkish military signal he learned during his service on the frontier. His shouts of warning, delivered in accented German mixed with Croatian phrases, convince nearby Hungarian cavalry that Ottoman forces have indeed infiltrated the camp. This fatal misunderstanding spreads through the camp like a poison. The Wallachian troops, already primed by their earlier warning cry, now believe they have confirmation of Ottoman presence. They begin to shout warnings in Romanian and Serbian. The Turks are here, they're calling on Allah. The Hungarian cavalry, caught between their German-speaking officers and their Wallachian comrades, find themselves in an impossible position. The darkness makes it impossible to distinguish friend from foe, and the babble of languages transforms familiar commands into enemy battle cries. Captain Mihaly Kossuth, a Hungarian officer whose family has served the Habsburg crown for 3 generations, finds himself confronting a nightmare scenario that no military academy had prepared him to handle. His squadron of light cavalry, awakened by the alarm, has assembled near their horse lines as training dictates. But the contradictory reports reaching him from different sources create an impossible tactical puzzle. His sergeant, Joseph Bathory, approaches with information that defies rational analysis. Captain, the Wallachians report Turkish infiltrators throughout the camp. The German officers are calling for formation, but their commands sound like Ottoman battle cries to the irregulars. And sir, Bathory's voice drops to a whisper. Some of our own men are beginning to wonder if the German officers might be Turkish spies themselves. The suggestion is absurd. Kossuth has served alongside these German officers for months, has shared their meals and their dangers. Major von Preysing in particular has proven himself a competent and honorable soldier, but in the fevered atmosphere of the camp, absurdity becomes plausible. If Turkish agents could penetrate so deeply into Austrian territory, if they could launch a coordinated assault on a major military encampment, what other deceptions might they have achieved? The psychological impact of this doubt cannot be overstated. Military effectiveness depends absolutely on trust. Trust in one's officers, trust in one's comrades, trust in the reliability of information, and the validity of orders. When that trust breaks down, even the most professional armies can disintegrate with shocking speed. Lieutenant Colonel Heinrich von Zach, a seasoned officer of the Austrian General Staff, attempts to restore order from his position near the artillery park. A veteran of multiple campaigns, he has seen panic before and knows that decisive action is required to prevent disaster. He orders his drummers to beat the assembly call, hoping that the familiar rhythm will cut through the chaos and rally the men to their colors. But von Zach's efforts to impose order face obstacles that his previous experience has not prepared him to handle. His staff officers, dispatched to carry orders to various regimental commanders, find themselves challenged by sentries who no longer recognize legitimate authority. In the darkness and confusion, even familiar faces become suspect. When Lieutenant Franz Müller attempts to deliver orders to the Hungarian cavalry, he is detained by Croatian guards who demand passwords that he does not know and explanations for his movement that he cannot provide in their language. The sound of drums in the darkness only adds to the confusion. To some soldiers, the beating drums signal the call to arms against a confirmed enemy attack. To others, already convinced that Turks have infiltrated the camp, the drums might be Ottoman military signals. The rhythm that should bring order instead spreads disorder, as different units interpret the same sound in different ways. Captain Alessandro Borghese, commanding a battery of Austrian field guns, faces a particularly complex tactical situation. His artillery pieces, powerful weapons capable of devastating enemy formations, could potentially restore order through the sheer psychological impact of their presence. But artillery in a confined space like a military camp is a double-edged weapon. A single misplaced shot could kill dozens of friendly soldiers, while the muzzle flash and noise of cannon fire might trigger even greater panic. Borghese's gunners, Italian professionals recruited from the northern provinces, await his orders with the disciplined patience of experienced artillerymen, but their very professionalism creates new problems in the current situation. These men are trained to follow orders without question, to serve their guns regardless of danger or confusion. If Borghese orders them to fire, they will comply instantly, even if the targets prove to be Austrian soldiers rather than Turkish invaders. The captain's dilemma becomes even more acute when he observes large groups of mounted figures moving rapidly through the camp. In daylight, he would easily recognize them as Hungarian cavalry conducting normal military maneuvers, but in the darkness, with reports of Turkish infiltration filling the air, these mounted figures might be Ottoman Sipahi, exploiting the confusion to position themselves for a devastating charge against the artillery park. Meanwhile, Sergeant Paolo Grimaldi, Borghese's senior non-commissioned officer, provides a steady stream of reports that increase rather than clarify the captain's understanding of the situation. Sir, the Hungarian cavalry appear to be forming for attack, but their movements are irregular. The German infantry are establishing defensive positions, but they're facing in different directions as if expecting attacks from multiple quarters. And the Wallachians, sir, the Wallachians are shooting at anything that moves. As the panic spreads, the careful military hierarchy that holds an army together begins to collapse. Junior officers, separated from their superiors in the darkness, make independent decisions based on incomplete information. A Hungarian captain, hearing gunfire and shouts about Turks, orders his men to mount their horses and prepare for a cavalry charge. A Croatian sergeant, seeing the Hungarian cavalry forming up in the darkness, assumes they are Ottoman Sipahi and prepares his men for defense. The personal story of Private Klaus Weiss illustrates how individual soldiers experience this collective breakdown. Weiss, a young farmer's son from Lower Austria, had joined the army 6 months earlier with dreams of glory and adventure. His letters home had been filled with enthusiasm for military life and confidence in Austrian superiority over the barbarous Turks. Now, crouched behind an overturned supply wagon with his musket loaded, but his hands shaking, he confronts a reality that bears no resemblance to his romantic notions of warfare. Through the darkness, Weiss can see figures moving rapidly in all directions. Some appear to be Austrian soldiers. He recognizes the familiar silhouettes of military equipment and the distinctive gait of men in uniform, but others seem foreign, alien, threatening. A group of horsemen gallops past his position, their faces hidden in shadow, their equipment creating unfamiliar sounds. Are they Hungarian cavalry responding to orders, or Turkish raiders exploiting the chaos? Weiss's sergeant, Johann Fuchs, a veteran of 20 years' service, attempts to maintain some semblance of unit cohesion. But Fuchs himself is struggling with doubts that he cannot voice to his men. The sounds of battle, sporadic gunfire, shouted commands, the clash of metal on metal, seem to come from every direction. Yet there is something wrong with these sounds, something that doesn't match his experience of genuine combat. Stay low, and watch for targets. Fuchs whispers to his squad, fire only when you're certain of enemy identification. But even as he gives this sensible order, Fuchs realizes its impossibility. In the current conditions, positive identification of anything is virtually impossible. The familiar landmarks of the camp have disappeared in the darkness, and the normal reference points that allow soldiers to navigate in combat no longer exist. The movement of troops in the darkness creates new sources of confusion. Companies attempting to reach their assigned positions collide with other units moving in different directions. The sound of hundreds of boots and hooves, the clatter of equipment, the shouts of officers trying to maintain control, all combine to create a cacophony that drowns out rational thought. In this acoustic fog of war, every sound becomes a potential threat, every movement a possible enemy advance. Lieutenant Giuseppe Torriani, an Italian engineer officer, finds himself caught between his technical training and the impossible demands of the current situation. His men, specialists in siege warfare and fortification, are among the most educated soldiers in the Austrian army. They understand ballistics, mathematics, and the scientific principles that govern modern warfare, but their analytical minds, so valuable in normal circumstances, become liabilities when applied to a situation that defies rational explanation. Sir, reports Sergeant Mario Benedetti, Torriani's senior engineer, our instruments detect no evidence of organized enemy activity. The patterns of movement and the distribution of gunfire are inconsistent with any known Turkish tactical doctrine. Yet, our own forces are clearly engaging in combat. Either we face a completely new form of warfare, or, he pauses, unwilling to voice the unthinkable conclusion. Captain Franz Haddock, commanding a company of Hungarian light infantry, finds himself caught in this maelstrom of confusion. His men, awakened by the gunfire and the cries of alarm, look to him for leadership and direction. But Haddock himself is struggling to understand what is happening. Through the darkness, he can see figures moving rapidly across the camp, but he cannot determine whether they are Austrian soldiers responding to orders or Ottoman infiltrators carrying out a surprise attack. Haddock's company occupies a strategic position near one of the main roads through the camp, making them potentially crucial for either defense or counterattack. But this advantageous position also makes them visible to other confused units, who might interpret their defensive preparations as evidence of enemy occupation. The captain's every decision carries the risk of escalating the situation beyond control. When a messenger arrives with orders to advance toward the sound of gunfire and engage the Turkish infiltrators, Haddock faces an impossible choice. The orders come through proper channels and bear the signature of a superior officer, but the messenger himself, a young Croatian irregular, whose German is heavily accented, might be an enemy agent, exploiting the chaos to misdirect Austrian forces. The captain's dilemma illustrates the impossible position faced by hundreds of officers throughout the camp. Military training demands immediate action in the face of enemy contact, but the darkness and confusion make it impossible to identify who is friend and who is foe. When Haddock sees a group of mounted figures approaching his position, he faces a terrible choice. If they are Austrian cavalry, firing on them would be murder. If they are Ottoman Sipahi, failing to fire would be suicide. The mounted figures, actually Hungarian hussars attempting to reach their assigned positions, present an equally impossible situation. In the darkness, they can see infantry formations ahead, but cannot determine their identity or intentions. The foot soldiers appear to be preparing for battle, their muskets gleaming in the moonlight. Are they Austrian troops forming defensive positions, or Ottoman janissaries preparing for assault? Captain Ispan Nadasdi, leading the Hussar squadron, has served with distinction in 3 previous campaigns against the Turks. His experience in irregular warfare, normally an invaluable asset, now becomes a source of additional confusion. He knows that Ottoman forces excel at night infiltration, that Turkish commanders often exploit gaps in enemy formations to achieve surprise attacks. The infantry position ahead could easily be a Turkish strongpoint established during the initial chaos. But Nadasdi also recognizes something familiar about the silhouettes ahead. The spacing between soldiers, the way they hold their weapons, the overall configuration of their position, all suggest European rather than Ottoman military practice. Yet his certainty wavers as he considers the possibility that Turkish forces might have adopted Austrian uniforms and tactics as part of an elaborate deception. This deadly game of identification plays out across the entire camp. Units that have trained together for months, that have shared the hardships of campaign life, now face each other across a few dozen yards of darkness with weapons ready. The bonds of military brotherhood, forged through shared danger and common purpose, begin to fray under the pressure of fear and uncertainty. Dr. Johann Zimmermann, the regimental surgeon attached to the Austrian headquarters, observes the unfolding catastrophe with the clinical eye of a medical professional. His training in anatomy and physiology provides him with unique insights into the physical manifestations of extreme fear. He watches as panic spreads through the camp like a contagious disease, noting how terror affects different men in different ways. Some soldiers become hyper-vigilant, their senses heightened to the point where every shadow becomes a threat, and every sound carries mortal danger. Others retreat into themselves, becoming virtually catatonic as their minds refuse to process the overwhelming stimuli of the chaotic environment. Still others display manic energy, rushing about without clear purpose, their nervous systems flooded with the chemicals of fight-or-flight response. Fear, Zimmermann notes in his journal, proves more contagious than any plague. It spreads through glances, through whispered rumors, through the simple observation of terror in one's comrades. A single man's panic can destroy the courage of an entire company, while the collapse of one unit can trigger the disintegration of an entire army. The surgeon's observations prove prophetic as the panic continues to spread. The situation deteriorates further when some soldiers, convinced that they are under Ottoman attack, begin to abandon their positions. These men, Many of them young recruits experiencing their first taste of genuine terror, flee toward what they believe is safety, but in the darkness, there is no safe direction. The camp is completely surrounded by confusion, and those who run from one perceived threat often collide with other panicked soldiers, creating new sources of alarm. The sight of their comrades fleeing has a devastating effect on military morale. Soldiers who might have held their positions under other circumstances begin to question their own courage and judgment. If experienced veterans are running, perhaps the situation is even worse than they thought. The contagion of panic spreads faster than any disease, transmitted through glances, gestures, and the universal language of fear. Corporal Heinrich Müller, a veteran of the 7 Years' War, who has faced Prussian cavalry charges and French artillery barrages, finds his hard-won composure cracking under the strain of the inexplicable. His squad of Austrian grenadiers, elite troops selected for their courage and discipline, look to him for the steady leadership that has carried them through previous battles. But Müller himself is struggling with doubts that threaten to overwhelm his professional training. "Corporal," whispers Private Johann Kraus, "what are we fighting? I can hear gunfire, but I can't see the enemy. I can hear commands, but they don't make sense. Are we winning or losing? Are we even in a battle?" Müller's inability to answer these fundamental questions strikes at the heart of military effectiveness. Soldiers can endure almost any hardship if they understand their purpose, can face almost any danger if they trust their leaders. But when the basic framework of military reality collapses, even the most disciplined troops lose their cohesion. The veteran corporal's response reveals the depth of the crisis. "Stay with me, lads. Follow my lead, and trust your training. We may not understand what's happening, but we know how to be soldiers." Yet even as he speaks these reassuring words, Müller can hear the doubt in his own voice. For the first time in 20 years of military service, his training provides no guidance for the situation he faces. As the chaos intensifies, the original cause of the disturbance, the drunken brawl over Schnapps, is completely forgotten. The Hungarian cavalry and Austrian infantry, who began the evening's events, are now scattered throughout the camp, some trying to restore order, others adding to the confusion. The merchants who sold the fateful bottles have long since vanished, their small commercial transaction having triggered a military catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. The communication systems that normally allow military forces to coordinate their actions prove completely inadequate for the current crisis. Written orders become useless when officers cannot find their intended recipients, or when the recipients cannot read the messages in the darkness. Verbal orders lose their meaning as they pass through multiple interpreters, each translation adding new distortions to the original message. Major Johann von Kleist, the senior intelligence officer attached to the army's headquarters, attempts to gather reliable information about the scope and nature of the Turkish attack. His network of informants, carefully cultivated over months of campaign activity, should provide accurate assessments of enemy capabilities and intentions. But every report he receives contradicts the others, creating a picture of such chaos and complexity that no rational analysis seems possible. From the northern sector of the camp, a Croatian captain reports heavy fighting against Turkish cavalry, with visible evidence of Ottoman standards and the sound of Turkish war cries. From the western sector, a Hungarian major describes successful resistance against Turkish infantry, noting the distinctive clothing and weapons of the attackers. Yet from the southern sector, an Austrian colonel reports no sign of enemy activity, only confused friendly forces firing at shadows. Von Kleist's attempts to reconcile these contradictory reports lead him to a conclusion that seems almost impossible to accept. Either the Austrian army faces a Turkish force of unprecedented size and sophistication, capable of simultaneous attacks from multiple directions with perfect coordination, or something else entirely is occurring. The darkness that initially concealed the true nature of the situation now becomes an active participant in the unfolding disaster. Every shadow harbors potential enemies. Every sound carries the threat of attack. The moon, partially obscured by clouds, provides just enough light to reveal moving figures without allowing clear identification. This visual uncertainty, combined with the acoustic confusion of multiple languages and commands, creates a perfect storm of military chaos. Captain Borghese, still wrestling with the decision whether to employ his artillery, receives a report that forces his hand. Lieutenant Müller, returning from a reconnaissance mission to the Hungarian sector, brings news that appears to confirm the worst fears about Turkish infiltration. "Captain," Müller reports, his voice tight with tension. "I've observed large formations of cavalry moving through the camp in coordinated patterns. Their equipment appears foreign, and their movements suggest familiarity with our defensive arrangements. If these are not Turkish forces, they represent a level of Austrian military activity that contradicts all current orders." The lieutenant's report, while technically accurate, omits crucial context that might have prevented the coming catastrophe. The cavalry movements he observed were indeed coordinated, but they represented Hungarian hussars attempting to respond to conflicting orders from their officers. The foreign equipment was simply Hungarian military gear, which differs in some details from Austrian standard issue, and the apparent familiarity with defensive arrangements reflected months of shared training rather than enemy intelligence gathering. But in the fevered atmosphere of the camp, Müller's report seems to confirm Turkish infiltration on a massive scale. Borghese, faced with the possibility that enemy cavalry might overrun his artillery position, makes the decision that will escalate the disaster beyond any possibility of control. "Load case shot," he orders his gun crews. "Prepare to fire on mounted targets approaching from the southeast." The decision, tactically sound if Turkish cavalry were indeed threatening the guns, becomes catastrophic when applied to friendly forces. By now, the panic has spread to every corner of the camp. What began as a localized disturbance has become a general alarm, with thousands of soldiers convinced that they are under imminent attack by Ottoman forces. The careful organization of the army, the product of months of training and preparation, dissolves in minutes under the pressure of collective fear. Sergeant Fuchs, still attempting to maintain control over his small squad of Austrian infantry, makes a decision that will haunt him for the rest of his life. Through the darkness, he sees a group of mounted figures approaching his position at high speed. Their silhouettes suggest cavalry equipment, and their rapid movement appears threatening. In the current atmosphere of terror and confusion, Fuchs interprets their approach as the beginning of a cavalry charge. "Fire!" he shouts, and his disciplined soldiers obey instantly. The volley of musket fire, 6 weapons discharging simultaneously, illuminates the darkness with brilliant flashes and fills the air with smoke and the smell of burned powder. The mounted figures, caught completely by surprise, cry out in pain and alarm as bullets find their targets. But the voices that cry out speak Hungarian, not Turkish. The mounted figures are members of Captain Nadasdy's Hussar squadron, attempting to reach their assigned positions in response to orders from their officers. The bullets that strike them are fired by Austrian soldiers who have mistaken their own comrades for enemy raiders. The sound of this first deliberate volley carries across the camp like a signal, convincing other units that general combat has begun. If one group of Austrian soldiers is firing, the reasoning goes, they must have identified legitimate targets. The example becomes contagious, as other nervous units open fire on anything that moves in the darkness. Private Weiss, still crouched behind his makeshift barricade, hears the volley and sees the muzzle flashes. To his terrified mind, the lights and sounds confirm everything he has been told about the Turkish attack. The enemy is not only present in the camp, but engaged in active combat with Austrian forces. His own survival now depends on his ability to identify and eliminate threats before they eliminate him. When a group of figures stumbles past his position, Weiss makes a decision based on fear rather than tactical judgment. The figures appear to be armed soldiers, but in the darkness, he cannot determine their identity or intentions. Their movements seem furtive, suspicious, threatening. Without waiting for orders from Sergeant Fuchs, Weiss raises his musket and fires. His target, Croatian irregular Joseph Maric, falls with a cry that echoes across the immediate area. Maric, a veteran of numerous border skirmishes with Turkish raiders, had been attempting to reach his unit's assembly point when Weiss's bullet struck him in the shoulder. His cry of pain and surprise, delivered in accented German mixed with Croatian phrases, convinces nearby Austrian soldiers that they have confirmed enemy presence. The shooting spreads like wildfire as fear overrides training and discipline. Units that have maintained their composure begin to fire at shadows, at sounds, at anything that might represent a threat. The careful fire discipline that distinguishes professional armies from armed mobs breaks down as soldiers react to immediate stimuli rather than tactical considerations. Captain Haddock, still struggling to understand the tactical situation, finds his position under fire from multiple directions. Bullets whistle overhead and strike the ground around his company's position, but he cannot determine their source. The muzzle flashes that should identify enemy positions seem to come from everywhere at once, suggesting either massive Turkish infiltration or friendly fire on an unprecedented scale. The moment of ultimate catastrophe arrives, when Captain Borghesi's artillery pieces join the firing. The Italian captain, convinced that his guns are under attack by Turkish cavalry, orders his crews to open fire with case shot, anti-personnel ammunition, designed to devastate cavalry charges. The 6-pound cannons, loaded with metal balls that spread like giant shotgun blasts, discharge with thunderous roars that can be heard for miles. The artillery fire, more than any other single factor, transforms confusion into catastrophe. The sound of cannon fire in a military camp can mean only one thing: major combat with a significant enemy force. Units that had maintained some semblance of discipline now abandon all restraint as they face what appears to be a general enemy assault supported by artillery. But Borghesi's target is not Turkish cavalry. His guns fire into a formation of Hungarian hussars who had been attempting to restore order in their sector. The case shot, devastating at close range, kills and wounds dozens of horsemen and their mounts. The surviving hussars, their formation shattered, and their comrades dead or dying around them, flee in terror from what they believe to be a Turkish artillery ambush. The sight of Hungarian cavalry in full retreat convinces other units that the battle is lost. If the elite light cavalry cannot hold their positions, what hope do ordinary infantry have against the Turkish onslaught? The retreat becomes a rout as entire companies abandon their positions and flee toward imagined safety. The stage is set for the next phase of the disaster. Soldiers who believe they are fighting for their lives against a deadly enemy will soon turn their weapons on their own comrades with increasing frequency and effectiveness. The Austrian Imperial Army, one of Europe's most formidable military forces, is about to demonstrate how quickly professional discipline can collapse when fear replaces reason. Major von Preysing, still attempting to maintain control over his battalion, finds his efforts frustrated by the complete breakdown of communication and command authority. His orders, even when they reach their intended recipients, are often misinterpreted or ignored by soldiers who no longer trust the information they receive. The careful hierarchy that allows armies to function as coordinated entities has collapsed under the pressure of collective panic. The major's own staff officers, men he has worked with for months, now question his orders and his competence. When he directs them to cease firing and attempt to identify targets before shooting, they interpret his commands as evidence that he has lost his nerve, or perhaps even been compromised by enemy agents. The trust that binds military units together dissolves as suspicion replaces confidence. Dr. Zimmerman, observing the disintegration from his medical station, notes the rapidity with which military order can collapse. An army, he writes in his journal, is like a complex machine in which every component must function precisely for the whole to operate effectively. Remove a few key elements: communication, trust, clear identification of threats, and the entire mechanism not only stops working but becomes actively destructive. The Battle of Karansabes is about to claim its first casualties, all of them inflicted by friendly fire, but these initial deaths and wounds represent only the beginning of a catastrophe that will see an entire army turn its weapons on itself in the darkness of a September night. The panic that began with a single misunderstood command has become an unstoppable force, consuming everything in its path with the inexorable power of a natural disaster. As the night deepens and the chaos spreads, thousands of professional soldiers find themselves trapped in a nightmare that no military training could have prepared them to face. They are fighting for their lives against an enemy that exists only in their own terrified imaginations, wielding their weapons against comrades they can no longer recognize in the darkness. The Austrian Imperial Army is about to discover that its greatest enemy is itself. Chapter 3: Friendly Fire Frenzy. When soldiers become enemies. The transformation from panic to violence occurs with terrifying swiftness. In the space of a few heartbeats, the Austrian Imperial Army crosses an invisible line from which there can be no return. The moment when fear becomes action, when imagined threats become deadly reality, marks one of the darkest chapters in military history. Picture yourself witnessing this terrible transition, as professional soldiers trained to protect each other turn their weapons against their own comrades. The first shots of what history would remember as the Battle of Karansabes ring out near the cavalry lines, where Hungarian hussars are attempting to mount their horses in the darkness. A Croatian border guard, his nerves stretched to the breaking point by the chaos around him, sees the mounted figures approaching through the gloom. To his terror-clouded mind, they appear to be Ottoman Sipahi cavalry, their curved sabers gleaming in the moonlight. Without hesitation, he raises his musket and fires. The musket ball, fired from barely 30 yards away, finds its mark. A Hungarian trooper, Corporal Istvan Kovacs, who moments before was simply trying to reach his assigned position, tumbles from his saddle with a cry of pain and confusion. The sound of his fall, the sharp crack of the musket, and his agonized shout in Hungarian create a new wave of terror through the surrounding darkness. The impact of that first deliberate shot reverberates through the camp like a thunderclap. Corporal Kovacs, a young man of 23 who had joined the Hussars to escape the poverty of his family's farm near Debrecen, lies bleeding in the mud between the tent lines. His horse, a spirited mare named Silug, that he had trained himself, rears and bolts into the darkness, adding to the chaos with her panicked whinnying and clattering hooves. Private Marko Juric, the Croatian border guard who fired the fatal shot, stares at his smoking musket with a mixture of pride and terror. He believes he has struck down an Ottoman infiltrator, possibly saving the lives of his comrades. But the voice crying out in pain speaks Hungarian, not Turkish, and something in the sound troubles the deepest part of his military instincts. Segit, 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 Kovacs gasps, calling for help in Magyar. The words mean nothing to Juric, whose knowledge of languages extends only to his native Croatian and the rudimentary German required for military service. To his ears, the foreign syllables might indeed be Turkish, or they might be the death cry of a fellow Austrian soldier. The Croatian guard, convinced he has killed an Ottoman infiltrator, shouts a warning to his comrades. Tershi, Tershi, ubijaju, Turks, the Turks are killing us. His cry, in the Slavic tongue of the military frontier, is taken up by other Croatian soldiers who rush to support their compatriot. But the Hungarian cavalry, seeing one of their own shot down by men they recognize as fellow Austrian soldiers, react with the fury of betrayal. Lieutenant Andras Sabo, a young officer whose father had died fighting the Turks at the siege of Belgrade, witnesses the shooting of his subordinate with horror and rage. The sight of Kovacs lying in his own blood, shot down by soldiers wearing Austrian uniforms, strikes at the very foundation of his military world. The bonds of brotherhood that should unite all Habsburg forces have been shattered by an act of violence that defies comprehension. The Croats have gone mad, shouts Sabo, drawing his saber. They're firing on their own. His words in Hungarian are incomprehensible to the Croatian guards, who see only mounted figures brandishing weapons and shouting in a foreign tongue. The language barriers that had been merely inconvenient during peacetime now become deadly obstacles to communication. The exchange of fire spreads rapidly outward from this initial confrontation. Hungarian cavalry, seeking to avenge their fallen comrade, charge toward the Croatian positions with the fury of men who believe they have been betrayed by their own allies. The sight of Hungarian hussars galloping toward them through the darkness confirms the worst fears of the Croatian border guards, who see what appears to be an Ottoman cavalry charge. The Croats, believing they are under attack by Turkish Sipahi using captured Austrian horses and equipment, form defensive squares according to their training, and pour volleys into the approaching horsemen. The irony is lost in the heat of battle. These men, all subjects of Emperor Joseph II, all sworn to defend the Habsburg monarchy, are now killing each other with the same weapons and tactics they had planned to use against the Ottoman Empire. The sound of gunfire, the screams of wounded horses, and the shouts of dying men create a symphony of chaos that drowns out all attempts at rational communication. Sergeant Josef Takacs, a veteran Hungarian non-commissioned officer, attempts to halt the charge by shouting orders in German, the official language of command. But his words are lost in the din of battle, and even if they had been heard, the Croatian guards would likely have interpreted them as Turkish battle cries. The Hungarian cavalry charge strikes the Croatian positions with devastating effect. Sabers clash against bayonets in hand-to-hand combat that is all the more vicious for being fought between men who should be allies. Trooper Petr Nagy, barely 18 years old and serving his first campaign, finds himself locked in mortal combat with a Croatian border guard who might have shared a drink with him the previous evening. The personal nature of the fighting makes it infinitely more traumatic than conventional battle. These men recognize each other's faces, know each other's names, have served together for months. Yet in the darkness and confusion, friend has become enemy, and survival depends on killing those who should be comrades. Major Wilhelm von Brenner, commanding the Austrian artillery battery positioned near the center of the camp, awakens to the sounds of battle raging around him. A veteran of the 7 Years' War who had served at the battles of Rossbach and Leuthen, he has extensive experience with night attacks and understands the critical importance of rapid response. From his position, he can see muzzle flashes in multiple directions, hear the distinctive crack of musket fire, and observe what appears to be cavalry charges in progress. Brenner's Batman, a grizzled veteran named Hans Müller, who has served as the major's personal attendant for 15 years, brings reports that seem to confirm the worst fears. "Sir, the Hungarians are fighting the Croats, but both sides claim the other has been infiltrated by Turks. The cavalry lines are in chaos, and there's heavy fighting near the supply wagons. What are your orders?" To Brenner's experienced eye, the evidence is overwhelming. The camp is under coordinated attack by Ottoman forces, using infiltration tactics to turn the Austrian units against each other. The simultaneous engagement of multiple units, the presence of enemy cavalry, and the intensity of the fighting all point to a well-planned night assault designed to exploit the multinational character of the Habsburg army. The major's analysis, while logical given the available information, is tragically wrong. But military training emphasizes rapid decision-making based on incomplete intelligence, and Brenner's experience tells him that hesitation in the face of enemy attack can be fatal. He issues immediate orders to his gun crews. "Load with canister, prepare to fire on the cavalry." The Austrian artillerymen, disciplined professionals recruited from the technical schools of northern Italy, leap to their tasks with practiced efficiency. These men represent the elite of Habsburg military technology, mathematically trained, mechanically skilled, capable of placing artillery fire with devastating precision. Canister rounds, essentially giant shotgun shells filled with metal balls, are rammed into the barrels of the 6-pound cannons, with the smooth efficiency born of countless hours of drill. Captain Alessandro Torriani, Brenner's senior battery commander, oversees the loading process with the meticulous care that characterizes professional artillery service. Each canister round contains 42 iron balls, carefully manufactured to precise specifications. When fired, these projectiles spread in a cone of destruction that can devastate infantry formations or cavalry charges at ranges up to 300 yards. But the enemy cavalry that Major Brenner has identified consists entirely of Hungarian hussars, Austrian soldiers, attempting to restore order to their own camp. The irony is lost in the darkness and confusion of the moment. Professional soldiers, trained to protect their comrades, are about to turn their most powerful weapons against their own forces. The first artillery discharge illuminates the camp in a brilliant flash of orange light that can be seen for miles across the Banat plain. The canister round, packed with dozens of iron balls, tears through a squadron of Hungarian cavalry with devastating effect. Men and horses are cut down in an instant, their screams adding to the cacophony of terror that engulfs the encampment. Lieutenant Mihaly Kossuth, whose squadron had been attempting to restore order in the eastern sector of the camp, finds himself in the direct path of the artillery fire. The young officer, descendant of a family that had fought for Habsburg interests for 3 generations, has time for one terrible moment of recognition before the canister round strikes his formation. The iron balls, traveling at tremendous velocity, tear through flesh and bone with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel and the force of a blacksmith's hammer. Kossuth's horse, a magnificent stallion that had been his pride and joy, is literally torn apart beneath him. The lieutenant himself survives the initial blast, but finds himself trapped beneath his dying mount, his leg shattered and his uniform soaked with blood. Around him, the remnants of his squadron present a scene from the deepest circles of hell. Men he has known for years lie dead or dying, their bodies twisted into unnatural positions by the impact of the artillery fire. The proud Hungarian hussars, who had awakened that morning as elite soldiers of the Habsburg Empire, are now reduced to broken figures crawling through their own blood. The surviving cavalry, shocked by the sudden artillery attack, scatter in all directions. Some flee toward the safety of the Timisha River, their horses splashing through the shallow water in desperate attempts to escape the killing ground. Others charge blindly into the darkness, their terror-crazed mounts carrying them deeper into the maze of tents and supply wagons where new dangers await. The artillery fire has an immediate and catastrophic effect on the morale of the entire army. To soldiers already convinced that they are under Ottoman attack, the sound of their own cannons seems to confirm the worst fears. The enemy must be present in overwhelming numbers to justify such desperate measures. The psychological impact of artillery, the thunderous roar that can be heard for miles, the brilliant muzzle flash that illuminates the entire camp, the earth-shaking concussion that is felt as much as heard, transforms fear into outright terror. Private Klaus Weber, the young Austrian infantryman, whose original confrontation with the Hungarian cavalry had helped trigger the night's events, crouches in a supply wagon, his musket clutched to his chest with trembling hands. The sound of the artillery fire convinces him that the camp is under massive assault by Turkish forces equipped with siege guns. The thunderous roar seems to come from everywhere at once, suggesting an enemy presence far beyond anything he had imagined possible. Weber's sergeant, Johann Hoffmann, attempts to maintain some semblance of unit cohesion, but his own nerves are stretched to the breaking point. A veteran of 20 years' service who has faced enemy fire in a dozen engagements, Hoffmann has never experienced anything like the current situation. The combination of darkness, confusion, and friendly fire creates a tactical environment for which no military manual has prepared him. "Stay together, lads," Hoffmann whispers to his squad. "Keep your heads down and watch for targets. Remember your training." But even as he speaks these reassuring words, the sergeant realizes their inadequacy. Military training assumes a rational enemy, following predictable patterns. The current situation defies all logic, all precedent, all understanding. Dr. Giovanni Martinelli, the Italian physician serving as regimental surgeon to the artillery brigade, observes the psychological disintegration with the clinical eye of a medical professional. From his field hospital, hastily established near the ammunition wagons, he can see the effects of extreme terror on the human mind and body. "Fear," he notes in his journal, writing by candlelight while artillery thunders overhead, "proves more destructive than any enemy weapon. I observe grown men reduced to the mental state of children, professional soldiers abandoning years of training, disciplined units, dissolving into terrified mobs. The mind, when overwhelmed by stimuli cannot process, simply ceases to function rationally." Captain Lorenzo Benedetti, commanding a company of Italian grenadiers from the Lombard provinces, sees the artillery fire and makes his own tragic miscalculation. His men, steady veterans from the Alpine provinces who have served together for years, have maintained their formation despite the chaos around them. The Italians, recruited from regions with long military traditions, possess a professional competence that has kept them effective even as other units disintegrate. Benedetti himself exemplifies the Italian military tradition: educated, technically competent, professionally ambitious. He had joined the Habsburg service as a young lieutenant, drawn by the opportunities for advancement in an empire that valued merit over birth. His company consists of carefully selected men, many of them former hunters and mountain guides whose marksmanship skills have been honed by years of alpine warfare. When Benedetti observes what appears to be enemy cavalry fleeing from the artillery bombardment, he sees an opportunity to strike a decisive blow against the Ottoman infiltrators. His tactical analysis, while fundamentally flawed, follows sound military principles. Enemy forces disrupted by artillery fire are vulnerable to infantry attack, and a well-timed advance could turn retreat into rout. "Form line, prepare to fire," he commands in Italian, his voice carrying the authority of professional competence. His grenadiers, disciplined soldiers who have served together through multiple campaigns, respond with mechanical precision. They level their muskets toward the approaching figures, their movements smooth and coordinated despite the chaos surrounding them. In the darkness, the Italian soldiers cannot see that their targets are Hungarian hussars, fellow Austrian soldiers fleeing from their own artillery. The fleeing cavalry, silhouetted against the fires burning throughout the camp, appear to be enemy forces retreating from successful Austrian resistance. The professional instincts that make the Italians effective soldiers now make them deadly enemies of their own side. The volley, when it comes, is devastating in its precision. 20 muskets fire as one, their combined firepower cutting down the approaching cavalry like a scythe through wheat. The Italian grenadiers, trained to deliver controlled, aimed fire rather than the wild shooting that characterizes less disciplined troops, achieve a level of lethality that would be impressive against any enemy. The Hungarian horsemen, already decimated by the artillery fire, are virtually annihilated by this final blow. Lieutenant Kossuth, still trapped beneath his dead horse, watches in horror as his surviving troopers are cut down by what he now recognizes as Austrian infantry. The young officer's last conscious thought before shock and blood loss claim him is a terrible understanding of what has happened to his army. The survivors, wounded and bleeding, crawl away into the darkness, leaving behind a scene of carnage that will haunt the camp for generations. The ground between the Italian positions and the artillery park becomes a field of bodies, Austrian soldiers killed by Austrian weapons in service of an imaginary enemy. Sergeant Marco Giuliani, Benedetti's senior non-commissioned officer, surveys the results of the volley with professional satisfaction tempered by growing unease. A veteran of campaigns in Silesia and Bohemia, Giuliani has seen many battlefields, but something about the current engagement troubles his experienced eye. The enemy cavalry fought strangely, Captain, he reports to Benedetti. Their formations were irregular, their equipment seemed familiar, and their cries. Giuliani pauses, unwilling to voice his growing suspicions. Their cries sounded almost like Hungarian, sir. But Captain Benedetti, committed to his tactical analysis and driven by the momentum of success, dismisses his sergeant's concerns. The enemy cavalry has been destroyed, but surely more Ottoman forces are moving through the camp. Military doctrine demands that success be exploited immediately, before the enemy can recover and reorganize. Form column. Advance. Benedetti orders. His grenadiers, proud of their victory and confident in their captain's leadership, march forward into the darkness, their bayonets gleaming in the moonlight. The Italian infantry, moving with the disciplined precision that distinguishes professional soldiers, advances toward what they believe is the next phase of their battle against Ottoman infiltrators. But their advance takes them directly into the positions held by a company of Austrian infantry from Lower Austria. These men, commanded by Captain Johann Müller, have been holding their ground despite the chaos around them through a combination of professional discipline and sheer stubborn determination. Müller, a career officer whose family has served the Habsburg monarchy for 4 generations, represents the backbone of Austrian military tradition. The Austrian company consists of men drawn from the farming communities of the Danube Valley, solid peasant stock accustomed to hardship and discipline. They have maintained their positions through hours of confusion and terror, trusting in their officers and their training, even as the world around them dissolves into chaos. Captain Müller, observing the approach of armed soldiers through the darkness, faces the same impossible tactical decision that has confronted dozens of officers throughout the night. The advancing figures appear to be enemy infantry, moving with the coordinated precision that suggests professional military training. Their foreign commands, Italian phrases that mean nothing to German-speaking ears, seem to confirm their hostile identity. The captain's decision is made more difficult by the evidence of recent combat around his position. The bodies of Hungarian cavalry, clearly visible in the flickering light of burning tents, suggest that his sector has already seen heavy fighting. The approach of additional armed forces, especially infantry advancing in formation, represents a clear and immediate threat to his men's survival. Prepare to receive infantry, Müller commands. His soldiers, veterans of training that emphasizes rapid response to enemy contact, level their muskets and prepare for battle. The Austrian infantry, like their Italian counterparts, represents the professional backbone of the Habsburg military system. Their training, their equipment, and their tactical doctrine are virtually identical to those of the approaching grenadiers. The confrontation that follows is brief but deadly. The Austrian infantry, believing they are under attack by enemy forces, open fire on their Italian comrades at a range of barely 50 yards. The Italians, convinced they are fighting Turkish janissaries, return the fire with equal intensity and professional competence. At point-blank range, the two companies pour volleys into each other with devastating effect. The narrow space between the tent lines becomes a killing ground where Austrian soldiers murder their compatriots in the darkness. The musket balls, fired by men trained to place their shots with lethal precision, find their targets with horrible efficiency. Professional soldiers, equipped with identical weapons and trained in identical tactics, demonstrate the devastating effectiveness of 18th century military technology when turned against its own creators. Private Franz Weber, the young soldier whose original fight with the Hungarian cavalry had helped trigger the night's events, finds himself face-to-face with an Italian grenadier in the hand-to-hand combat that follows the exchange of volleys. The Italian, a mountain guide named Giuseppe Bertolini, attacks with the skill and determination of a professional warrior defending his homeland. The two men, both subjects of the same emperor, both sworn to defend the same cause, struggle desperately in the mud between the tents. Weber's bayonet clashes against Bertolini's in a deadly dance that neither man fully understands. They fight with the fury of mortal enemies, driven by fear and confusion rather than any rational cause. The death of Bertolini, run through by Weber's bayonet, represents the complete collapse of military brotherhood. The Italian grenadier dies believing he has fallen in battle against Ottoman invaders, while Weber thinks he has killed a Turkish infiltrator. Neither man realizes that they have become victims of the most tragic form of warfare, soldiers killing soldiers in service of an imaginary enemy. The sound of this intense firefight draws other units into the expanding circle of violence. A company of Hungarian infantry, moving to support what they believe are their Austrian allies under attack, stumbles into the crossfire between the Italians and the lower Austrians. Unable to distinguish friend from foe in the darkness, they begin firing at both groups, adding their own deadly contribution to the carnage. Captain Ferenc Nagy, commanding the Hungarian infantry, faces an impossible tactical situation. His men, approaching what they believed was a friendly position, find themselves under fire from multiple directions. The muzzle flashes that should identify enemy positions seem to come from everywhere at once, suggesting either massive Turkish infiltration or friendly fire on an unprecedented scale. Nagy's attempts to identify himself and his unit are frustrated by the language barriers that have plagued the army throughout the campaign. His shouts in Hungarian are misinterpreted as Turkish battle cries by the Italian and Austrian troops, while his men interpret the German and Italian commands they hear as evidence of enemy presence. The Hungarian infantry, caught in a deadly crossfire, suffer terrible casualties in the first few minutes of contact. Lieutenant Gabor Horváth, Nagy's second in command, falls with a bullet through his chest. His last words a confused question about why Austrian soldiers are shooting at him. The young officer's death, witnessed by his men, convinces them that enemy agents have somehow infiltrated their allied units. The camp has now become a maze of deadly encounters, where every shadow might conceal an enemy, every sound might herald an attack. Units that have trained together, that have shared the hardships of campaign life, now face each other across a few yards of darkness with weapons ready. The bonds of military brotherhood, forged through months of shared danger, dissolve under the pressure of fear and confusion. Supply wagons, abandoned by their terrified drivers, become obstacles that channel the movement of troops into deadly bottlenecks. The teamsters and camp followers, civilian personnel essential to military operations, flee in terror as the army they serve destroys itself around them. Their abandoned wagons, loaded with ammunition and supplies, become cover for soldiers shooting at their own comrades. Master Sergeant Wilhelm Krantz, responsible for the ammunition supplies, witnesses the systematic destruction of his carefully maintained stockpiles. The powder kegs and musket balls that should have supported the campaign against the Ottomans are instead being used to kill Austrian soldiers. The irony is not lost on the old sergeant, who has spent 30 years ensuring that Habsburg forces have the supplies they need for victory. 30 years I've served this army, Krantz mutters to his assistant, watching soldiers fight over cartridge boxes that should have been distributed for the morning's advance. 30 years and I've never seen anything like this. We're destroying ourselves faster than any enemy could. The systematic consumption of military supplies represents another dimension of the catastrophe. Each musket ball fired, each powder charge expended, each piece of equipment abandoned or destroyed weakens the army's capacity for actual military operations. The resources accumulated for months of careful planning are being squandered in a single night of fratricidal violence. Soldiers stumbling over tent ropes and supply crates find themselves exposed to fire from multiple directions. The careful organization of the camp, designed to facilitate military efficiency, now becomes a trap that confines the army within the killing ground of its own making. The neat rows of tents, the precisely measured intervals between units, the careful placement of supply dumps, all these features of military planning now serve to concentrate the violence and maximize the casualties. Dr. Franz Weiss, the senior medical officer attached to the army's headquarters, attempts to establish aid stations for the wounded, but discovers that his efforts are hampered by continued fighting around every potential medical facility. The red flags that should mark field hospitals as neutral ground become targets for soldiers, convinced that enemy agents are using medical facilities as cover for military operations. The wounded themselves become sources of additional confusion, as their cries for help in various languages are misinterpreted as signals between enemy forces. A Croatian border guard, crying for assistance in his native tongue, is shot by Austrian infantry, who mistake his pleas for Turkish battle cries. A Hungarian cavalry officer, calling for a medic in Magyar, is bayoneted by Italian grenadiers, who believe he is directing enemy movements. The medical staff, trained to treat wounds rather than inflict them, find themselves caught between their professional obligations and their personal survival. Antonio Rossi, an Italian physician serving with the artillery, attempts to tend to wounded Hungarian cavalry, only to be fired upon by Austrian infantry, who mistake his movements for hostile activity. Medicine becomes impossible, Dr. Rossi writes in his journal. When the act of healing is interpreted as an act of war, I cannot treat the wounded when approaching them, marks me as an enemy. The Hippocratic Oath demands that I preserve life, but military necessity suggests that movement in the darkness equals death. The darkness, which initially concealed the true nature of the situation, now becomes an active participant in the slaughter. Every muzzle flash reveals new targets. Every scream draws more soldiers into the web of violence. The moon, still partially obscured by clouds, provides just enough light to allow aimed fire without permitting clear identification of targets. This visual environment creates optimal conditions for friendly fire incidents. Soldiers can see enough to aim their weapons, but not enough to identify their targets. The familiar landmarks of the camp, the regimental colors, the distinctive uniforms, the recognizable faces of comrades, all disappear in the darkness, replaced by anonymous figures that might be friend or foe. Captain Tomislav Jurisic, commanding the Croatian border guards, recognizes the tactical impossibility of the current situation. His men, experienced in night fighting against Turkish raiders, understand that effective combat in darkness requires careful coordination and clear identification of targets. The current chaos makes such coordination impossible. We fight shadows, Jurisic tells his sergeant. Every target we engage might be our own people. Every position we attack might be held by our allies. This is not warfare. This is madness. But even as he speaks these words, the captain continues to direct his men's fire against figures moving through the darkness. Military training demands action, even when action seems futile. As the battle reaches its crescendo, the original cause of the disturbance is completely forgotten. The Hungarian cavalry and Austrian infantry who began the evening with a simple dispute over Schnapps are now scattered throughout the camp, some dead, others wounded, all participants in a tragedy that has consumed their entire army. The merchants who sold the fateful bottles have become footnotes in a disaster that will reshape military history. The ammunition supplies, carefully stockpiled for the campaign against the Ottomans, are now being expended against Austrian soldiers. Powder horns are emptied, musket balls are fired, and canister rounds are discharged in a fratricidal orgy of destruction. The resources intended to conquer Ottoman territory are instead being used to destroy the Austrian army itself. Lieutenant Franz Kohler, responsible for ammunition distribution to the infantry regiments, watches in horror as his carefully maintained supplies disappear into the night's violence. The cartridge boxes that should have supported weeks of campaign operations are being emptied in hours of fratricidal combat. Each shot fired represents not only an immediate casualty, but a reduction in the army's long-term capability. At this rate, Kohler calculates grimly, we'll have expended our entire ammunition reserve before dawn. Even if we survive this night, we'll be defenseless against any actual enemy attack. The irony is devastating. The army is destroying its own capacity for self-defense in the process of defending itself against imaginary threats. The systematic breakdown of military hierarchy represents another critical dimension of the disaster. Junior officers, separated from their superiors in the darkness, make independent decisions based on incomplete information and personal terror. The careful chain of command that allows armies to function as coordinated entities dissolves as each unit becomes an independent actor in the night's chaos. Major Heinrich von Rothenburg, attempting to reach his regimental headquarters, finds himself lost in a camp that has become utterly foreign to him. The familiar landmarks, the commander's tent, the regimental colors, the orderly rows of company areas, have disappeared in the confusion. Every attempt to move toward his destination brings him into contact with nervous sentries who challenge his identity and question his authority. The major's staff officers, dispatched to carry orders to various units, become casualties of the night's violence. Lieutenant Anton Schwartz, carrying urgent orders to cease fire and reform, is shot down by Croatian guards who mistake him for a Turkish messenger. His death eliminates not only a competent officer, but also the information that might have prevented further casualties. The loss of communication between different levels of command creates a cascade of tactical failures. Orders that might restore order never reach their intended recipients, while reports that might clarify the situation never reach decision-makers. The army becomes a collection of isolated units, each fighting its own battle against enemies that exist only in imagination. By the deepest hour of the night, the Battle of Caransebes has claimed thousands of casualties. The Austrian Imperial Army, one of Europe's most formidable military forces, has achieved the impossible. It has defeated itself. The dawn will reveal the true extent of the catastrophe, but for now, the darkness mercifully conceals the magnitude of the disaster. The firing begins to slacken as ammunition runs low, and exhaustion takes its toll. Soldiers who have been fighting for hours begin to realize that something is terribly wrong. The enemy they have been battling seems to know Austrian military procedures, to use familiar weapons, to fight with techniques learned in the same training grounds. But the recognition comes too late. The damage has been done. Sergeant Joseph Takacs, the Hungarian cavalryman whose letters had documented the campaign's earlier phases, finds himself among the survivors huddled near the riverbank. His squadron has been virtually eliminated, his captain is dead, and his horse lies somewhere in the darkness with a bullet through her head. The young sergeant's last letter, written by candlelight as dawn approaches, captures the horror of the night's events. "We have met the enemy," Tekars writes, "and he is us. The Turkish army could not have achieved what we have done to ourselves in a single night. We came to this place as soldiers of the Emperor, proud warriors ready to defend Christendom against the infidel. We will leave, those of us who survive, as broken men who have learned that the greatest enemy of any army is itself." As the first pale light of dawn begins to creep across the horizon, individual soldiers begin to recognize the true nature of their situation. The bodies scattered across the camp wear Austrian uniforms, carry familiar weapons, bear the faces of men they have known and served with. The terrible reality of what has occurred begins to penetrate the fog of fear and confusion that has dominated the night. Private Klaus Weber, the young Austrian who had helped trigger the evening's events, stumbles through the camp in a daze, seeking his company's position. The familiar landmarks of his military life have disappeared, replaced by a landscape of destruction that seems to belong to some foreign battlefield. When he finally locates his unit's area, he finds only corpses and abandoned equipment. The young soldier's discovery of his sergeant's body, Johann Hoffmann, killed by a bullet that might have come from any of a dozen different units, forces him to confront the magnitude of the catastrophe. The steady veteran who had represented everything admirable about Austrian military tradition lies dead in the mud, killed not by Turkish bullets, but by Austrian weapons fired by Austrian hands. Weber's mental collapse, witnessed by Dr. Martinelli as he tends to the wounded, represents the psychological cost of the night's events. The mind, the Italian physician notes, cannot easily process the reality that one has participated in the destruction of everything one has been trained to protect. Some of these men will never recover from what they have done to each other. The Austrian Imperial Army prepares to confront the devastating truth of what it has done to itself. The Battle of Caransebes is ending, but its consequences will echo through military history for centuries to come. The camp, once a symbol of Habsburg military power, has become a monument to the fragility of military discipline and the devastating potential of friendly fire. Colonel Franz von Colloredo, the senior commander who had attempted to maintain order throughout the night, surveys the wreckage of his command as the sun rises over the Timish River. The careful organization that had taken months to achieve has been destroyed in a single night of fratricidal violence. The casualties exceed those of many conventional battles, but these losses were inflicted by the army upon itself. The colonel's first priority must be to prevent any actual Turkish forces from discovering the Austrian army's weakened condition. The irony is bitter. Having expended most of their ammunition fighting each other, the Austrians are now virtually defenseless against the real enemy they had come to fight. The Battle of Caransebes has achieved what no Ottoman general could have hoped to accomplish. As reports begin to reach headquarters from the various regimental commanders, the full scope of the disaster becomes apparent. Entire companies have been virtually eliminated, ammunition supplies are nearly exhausted, and the army's command structure has been severely disrupted. The professional military force that had awakened the previous evening no longer exists as an effective fighting unit. The task of explaining this catastrophe to higher authorities, to the emperor himself, weighs heavily on Colloredo's mind. How does one report that an elite army has destroyed itself without any enemy intervention? How does one explain casualties inflicted entirely by friendly fire? How does one justify the loss of an entire campaign to a single night of confusion and terror? The Battle of Caransabes stands as perhaps the most dramatic example in military history of how quickly professional armies can disintegrate when the bonds of trust and communication break down. The dawn of September 18, 1788, reveals not the aftermath of a heroic battle against the enemies of Christendom, but the wreckage of an army that has become its own worst enemy. Chapter 4. A Costly Blunder. Dawn's Terrible Revelation. The first light of September 18, 1788, creeps across the battlefield of Caransabes with the gentle persistence of truth itself. As the pale fingers of dawn touch the mist rising from the Timanche River, they illuminate a scene that defies comprehension. The Austrian Imperial Army, which had encamped here the previous evening as a disciplined fighting force of nearly 100,000 men, now lies scattered across the landscape in fragments of its former self. Picture yourself standing on a small rise, overlooking the camp as the morning light reveals the magnitude of the disaster. Where once stood orderly rows of white canvas tents, there now spreads a panorama of destruction. Tents have been trampled flat, supply wagons overturned, and the careful geometric precision of military encampment has dissolved into chaos. Wisps of smoke rise from scattered fires, and the acrid smell of burnt gunpowder mingles with the fresher scents of morning dew and river mist. The silence is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the scene. After the thunderous cacophony of the night's fighting, the relative quiet feels unnatural, broken only by the occasional groan of wounded men and the nervous whinnying of horses that have broken free from their picket lines. This is not the silence of victory or defeat, but something far more disturbing, the silence of an army that has consumed itself. Major General Count Friedrich von Hoditz, the Austrian field commander, emerges from his headquarters tent with the careful movements of a man who has aged years in a single night. His uniform, usually immaculate, bears the stains and tears of his desperate attempts to restore order during the chaos. His face, pale in the morning light, reflects the terrible understanding that has been growing throughout the long hours of darkness. Von Hoditz represents everything that was supposed to make the Habsburg military system effective. Born into an ancient noble family with a tradition of military service stretching back to the Crusades, educated in the finest military academies of Europe, experienced in the complex diplomacy and warfare of the 18th century, he had been selected for this command based on a lifetime of preparation. Yet all his advantages of birth, education, and experience had proven useless against the chaos that engulfed his army in a single night. The general's aide-de-camp, Major Anton von Seckendorf Abadar, approaches with a preliminary casualty report that makes grim reading. The young officer, himself wounded in the night's fighting when he was mistaken for a Turkish spy by Croatian guards, delivers his report with the mechanical precision of military training overlaying deep personal trauma. Sir Seckendorf Abadar reports, his voice steady despite the bandage covering a gash on his forehead. Initial estimates suggest casualty rates approaching 40% across all units. The Hungarian cavalry regiments have suffered the worst losses. The 3rd Hussars have lost 2/3 of their effective strength. The artillery batteries report complete disruption of command structure. Sir, the major pauses, struggling with the words. Sir, we have no confirmed enemy casualties. All losses appear to be self-inflicted. As Hoditz surveys the destruction, the full scope of the catastrophe becomes clear. Bodies lie scattered across the camp, but they wear no Ottoman turbans, carry no Turkish weapons. These are Austrian soldiers, identifiable by their familiar uniforms, their regimental insignia, their European features. Hungarian hussars lie next to Croatian border guards, Italian grenadiers beside German-speaking infantry from Lower Austria. The diversity that had been the empire's strength has become its tragedy. The general's mind, trained to analyze tactical situations and formulate military responses, struggles to process the reality before him. Every principle of warfare, every lesson learned through decades of study and experience, becomes irrelevant when applied to a situation where an army has destroyed itself. The tactical manuals that filled his military library contain no guidance for recovering from self-inflicted defeat. The casualty reports, when they finally reach headquarters in their complete form, tell a story almost too incredible to believe. Nearly 10,000 Austrian soldiers lie dead or wounded across the battlefield, not a single one killed by Ottoman bullets. Every casualty is the result of friendly fire, every death a testament to the devastating power of fear and confusion. The Austrian Imperial Army has achieved something unprecedented in military history. It has inflicted a major defeat upon itself without any enemy action whatsoever. Dr. Johann Zimmermann, the Army's chief medical officer, provides clinical details that make the statistics even more horrifying. The wound patterns, he reports to von Hoditz, are consistent with close-range engagements using our own weapons, musket balls from Austrian firearms, canister shot from Habsburg artillery, bayonet wounds inflicted by regulation blades. From a medical perspective, the evidence is unambiguous. Every injury was caused by Austrian soldiers attacking other Austrian soldiers. The doctor's analysis extends beyond the purely physical. The psychological trauma, general, may prove even more devastating than the physical wounds. Many of the survivors display symptoms I have never encountered before, a form of melancholia that seems to result from the knowledge that they have killed their own comrades. They speak of dreams where they cannot distinguish friend from foe, of waking terrors where every uniform appears hostile. Captain Franz Hadik, the Hungarian light infantry officer, who had struggled so desperately to understand the situation in the darkness, now stands amid the wreckage of his company. Of the 120 men who had answered roll call the previous evening, fewer than 60 remain fit for duty. The others lie wounded or dead, victims of Austrian musket balls and canister shot. Hadik himself bears a bandage around his left arm, wounded by a bullet fired by Croatian soldiers who mistook him for a Turkish officer. The captain's personal account, recorded by staff officers attempting to reconstruct the night's events, provides insight into the human experience of military catastrophe. At approximately 10 o'clock, Hadik reports, "My company was in position near the supply wagons when we observed what appeared to be enemy cavalry approaching from the southeast. The moonlight made identification difficult, but their movements suggested hostile intent. We prepared to receive a charge." The clinical language of military reporting cannot disguise the horror of what followed. The approaching cavalry proved to be Hungarian hussars fleeing from artillery fire. We did not recognize them as friendly forces until after we had engaged them with concentrated musket fire. The realization that we had fired upon our own cavalry, Hadik's voice trails off, unable to complete the sentence. The medical officers, overwhelmed by the scale of the casualties, work with grim efficiency to tend the wounded. Field surgeon Dr. Anton Kleist moves from patient to patient with the methodical precision of long experience, but even his professional composure cracks as he confronts the reality of the situation. These wounds were inflicted by weapons he knows intimately. Austrian muskets, Habsburg artillery, the familiar tools of his own army's trade. Dr. Kleist's field journal, maintained throughout the campaign, provides a unique medical perspective on the disaster. September 18th dawn. The casualties present wound patterns consistent with European military firearms rather than Turkish weapons. The musket balls are of familiar caliber. The blade wounds show characteristics of Austrian bayonets. Most disturbing is the evidence that many wounds were inflicted at extremely close range, suggesting hand-to-hand combat between soldiers who should have recognized each other as allies. The most disturbing aspect of the medical examination is the evidence it provides of the night's confusion. Wounded soldiers tell contradictory stories of their experiences, each convinced that he was fighting against Ottoman infiltrators. A Hungarian hussar swears that he was attacked by Turkish janissaries, only to learn that his wounds were inflicted by Italian grenadiers. A Croatian border guard insists that he repelled a charge by Ottoman Sipahi cavalry, not realizing that he had been firing at his own side's Hungarian light horse. Sergeant Josef Takarts, the Hungarian cavalry non-commissioned officer, whose letters had documented the campaign's progress, lies in the field hospital with a shattered leg and a growing understanding of what has occurred. His account, dictated to a medical orderly, captures the psychological disorientation that affects many survivors. "I remember charging toward what I believed were Turkish positions," Takas recalls. "The enemy appeared to be well organized, firing disciplined volleys and moving with military precision. Only when I heard them shouting in Italian did I begin to suspect that something was wrong. But by then, the battle had its own momentum. Men who had been drinking together the previous evening were killing each other in the darkness." Lieutenant Colonel Heinrich von Zach, the staff officer who had attempted to restore order with drum calls, now faces the impossible task of compiling an accurate report of the night's events. As he interviews survivors and examines the evidence scattered across the battlefield, a picture emerges of cascading failures in communication, identification, and command control. Each decision, individually rational given the limited information available, had contributed to the overall catastrophe. Von Zach's methodology reveals the intellectual approach of Austrian military science applied to an unprecedented situation. He establishes a chronological timeline of events, maps the movements of different units, and attempts to identify the decision points where alternative actions might have prevented the disaster. But the deeper he delves into the evidence, the more complex and inexplicable the situation becomes. The initial trigger, von Zach notes in his preliminary analysis, appears to have been a commercial dispute over alcoholic beverages between Hungarian cavalry and Wallachian merchants. This minor incident escalated into a physical altercation involving Austrian infantry, which in turn was misinterpreted as evidence of Ottoman infiltration. Each subsequent event followed logically from the previous one, yet the cumulative effect was catastrophic. The colonel's investigation reveals the critical role played by linguistic confusion. The command halt, repeated in German throughout the camp, was interpreted by some Wallachian troops as Allah, the sacred name invoked by Muslim soldiers in battle. This misunderstanding convinced them that Ottoman forces were present and actively engaged in combat. Their warnings, delivered in Romanian and Serbian, were in turn misinterpreted by other units as confirmation of enemy presence. Von Zach's analysis extends to the broader implications of the disaster. The Battle of Karansebes demonstrates the fundamental vulnerability of multinational military forces to breakdowns in communication and coordination. The diversity that provides tactical flexibility in normal circumstances becomes a critical weakness when clear identification and rapid communication become essential for survival. The Austrian artillery battery, which had fired with such devastating effect against the Hungarian cavalry, stands silent in the morning light. The gun crews, professional soldiers who take pride in their accuracy and efficiency, now confront the terrible reality of their success. Major Wilhelm von Brenner, the battery commander, sits on an overturned ammunition box, staring at the evidence of his handiwork. The canister rounds that had performed so perfectly had torn apart his own comrades with mechanical precision. Captain Alessandro Torriani, the Italian artillery officer who had supervised the loading and firing of the guns, provides a technical analysis that makes the tragedy even more poignant. The canister rounds functioned exactly as designed, he reports. Each shot contained 42 iron balls, distributed in a cone pattern that achieved optimal coverage of the target area. The Hungarian cavalry, advancing in formation, presented a textbook target for anti-cavalry fire. Our accuracy was exceptional and utterly misapplied. The artillery crews, trained to take pride in their technical competence and professional effectiveness, struggle with the knowledge that their skill had been turned against their own side. Sergeant Paolo Grimaldi, whose careful maintenance of the guns had ensured their perfect function, speaks for many when he observes, "We have spent years learning to serve these weapons effectively against the enemies of the Empire. Never did we imagine that our greatest enemy would be our own confusion." The psychological impact on the gunners proves severe and lasting. Several refuse to serve the artillery pieces, claiming that they can no longer trust their ability to distinguish friend from foe. Others develop a nervous condition that makes them unable to function effectively in combat situations. The technical precision that had made them valuable soldiers becomes a source of trauma when they realize how precisely they had killed their own comrades. As the morning progresses, search parties fan out across the surrounding countryside, seeking soldiers who fled during the night's confusion. Many are found hiding in the forests and ravines around Karansebes, still convinced that the camp has been overrun by Ottoman forces. These men, when informed of the true nature of the previous night's battle, react with disbelief, denial, and finally, crushing shame. Private Klaus Weber, the young Austrian infantryman, whose original confrontation with Hungarian cavalry had helped trigger the disaster, is discovered hiding in a peasant's root cellar 3 miles from the camp. His account of the night's events reveals the complete breakdown of military order from an individual soldier's perspective. After the fighting began, Weber reports, "I became separated from my unit and found myself alone in the darkness. Every sound seemed to indicate enemy movement. Every shadow appeared to conceal Turkish infiltrators. I fired my musket several times at figures I believed to be enemies, but I could never be certain of my targets. When dawn came, I realized that I might have been shooting at our own men all along." The discovery of these scattered soldiers reveals the geographical scope of the disaster. Men had fled in every direction from the camp, some traveling many miles before exhaustion forced them to seek shelter. Their terror had been so complete that many abandoned not only their weapons but also their uniforms, stripping off anything that might identify them as soldiers and thus potential targets. Lieutenant Giuseppe Toriani, the Italian engineer, whose analytical mind had struggled to comprehend the night's events, provides insight into the psychological mechanisms that drove the flight. The human mind, he observes, cannot long sustain the cognitive dissonance of fighting an enemy that appears identical to oneself. When the familiar becomes threatening, when allies become enemies, the instinct for self-preservation overrides all military training. The logistical impact of the disaster becomes apparent as supply officers attempt to assess the damage to equipment and material. Thousands of muskets lie scattered across the battlefield, many damaged beyond repair. Artillery pieces sit abandoned, their crews dead or dispersed. Ammunition supplies, carefully accumulated for the campaign against the Ottomans, have been largely expended in fratricidal combat. The army's ability to continue offensive operations has been catastrophically compromised. Master Quartermaster Wilhelm Krantz, responsible for the army's supply systems, surveys the wreckage with the eye of a professional logistician. His assessment reveals the broader implications of the night's disaster beyond the immediate casualties. The loss of equipment, Krantz reports, represents months of preparation and enormous financial investment. More critically, the disruption of our supply chains and the destruction of our ammunition reserves leave us incapable of sustained military operations. The quartermaster's detailed inventory makes sobering reading. We estimate the loss of approximately 8,000 muskets, 200 swords and sabers, 50 artillery pieces of various calibers, and the equivalent of 3 months' ammunition supply for the entire army. The horses lost, both cavalry mounts and artillery draft animals, represent an irreplaceable resource that cannot be quickly restored. Beyond the material losses, the disruption of military organization creates ongoing logistical challenges. Many units have lost their organizational structure. Krantz continues. Companies have been scattered, officers separated from their men, specialized personnel killed or wounded. Even if we could replace the lost equipment, we lack the human organization necessary to employ it effectively. The financial implications of the disaster extend far beyond the immediate military context. The Austrian Empire's military budget, already strained by the costs of maintaining forces across multiple theaters, cannot easily absorb the losses sustained at Caronsabays. The economic impact will be felt for years, affecting not only military operations but also the broader fiscal health of the Habsburg state. The psychological damage proves even more severe than the physical losses. Professional soldiers who had taken pride in their training and discipline now question everything they thought they knew about military service. The bonds of trust that hold an army together, trust in officers, trust in comrades, trust in the system itself, have been shattered by the night's events. Many survivors will never again be able to serve effectively in combat, their confidence permanently undermined by the knowledge that they had killed their own brothers in arms. Dr. Franz Weiss, a military physician specializing in the treatment of nervous disorders, documents the unprecedented psychological casualties of the battle. I observe symptoms that have no parallel in my previous experience, he reports. Soldiers who had shown no previous signs of mental distress now display extreme anxiety when weapons are present, panic attacks when hearing unexpected sounds, and a persistent inability to trust their own perceptions. The doctor's clinical observations reveal the depth of the trauma. Many patients speak of a fundamental loss of certainty about reality itself. If they could mistake their own comrades for enemies under stress, they reason, how can they trust any of their perceptions or judgments? This epistemological crisis appears to be more devastating to military effectiveness than physical wounds. Corporal Heinrich Müller, the veteran Austrian who had attempted to maintain order during the chaos, exemplifies the psychological casualties of the battle. A soldier with 20 years of distinguished service, Müller had been a pillar of reliability and competence. Now, according to Dr. Weiss's notes, he suffers from nightmares, trembling fits, and an inability to concentrate on simple tasks. I cannot trust myself, Müller tells the doctor. If I could fire upon my own sergeant in the darkness, believing him to be an enemy, what other terrible mistakes might I make? How can any soldier ever again be certain that his actions are justified? The veteran's crisis of confidence reflects a broader pattern among the survivors. Word of the disaster spreads beyond the immediate battlefield with remarkable speed. Civilian refugees, fleeing what they believe to be an Ottoman victory, carry tales of Austrian defeat to surrounding towns and villages. These stories, distorted by fear and incomplete understanding, describe a massive Turkish assault that has destroyed the Austrian army. The propaganda value to the Ottoman Empire is immense, even though no Ottoman soldier participated in the battle. The merchant Gheorghe Popescu, whose Schnapps had inadvertently triggered the catastrophe, finds himself fleeing alongside other civilian camp followers as news of the Ottoman victory spreads through the countryside. His first-hand knowledge of the battle's true cause provides a unique perspective on how quickly reality can be transformed by collective misunderstanding. "I watched the whole thing begin," Popescu later tells authorities in Timisoara. "It started with a simple business transaction, Hungarian soldiers buying liquor from my wagon. A fight broke out over payment, then someone fired a musket, and within minutes the entire camp was convinced of a Turkish attack. I saw Austrian soldiers killing each other while shouting about Turkish infiltrators who existed only in their imagination." But Popescu's account, accurate though it is, seems too fantastic to be credible to those who hear it secondhand. The story becomes simplified and distorted as it passes from person to person, eventually settling into a narrative that makes more conventional sense, a surprise Ottoman attack that overwhelmed Austrian defenses through superior numbers and tactical cunning. The speed with which these distorted accounts spread demonstrates the power of narrative coherence over factual accuracy. People find it easier to believe in a dramatic Ottoman victory than in the possibility that a professional army could destroy itself through confusion and friendly fire. The true story of Karansabes becomes lost in a mythology that serves the psychological needs of those who hear it. It is into this scene of devastation that the real Ottoman army finally arrives. Turkish scouts, probing forward to assess Austrian positions, discover the aftermath of the Battle of Karansabes with amazement and delight. The fortress that they had expected to besiege is defended by the remnants of a shattered army, its walls unmanned, its approaches unguarded. The Austrian disaster has handed them a victory without the necessity of battle. Mehmet A., leading a reconnaissance unit of Turkish irregulars, provides the first Ottoman account of the discovery. "We approached expecting to observe Austrian defensive preparations," he reports to his superiors. "Instead, we found a battlefield covered with Austrian dead and wounded, with no evidence of Ottoman participation. The enemy appeared to have destroyed themselves without our intervention." The Ottoman commander, Yusuf Pasha, surveying the destruction from a nearby hilltop, initially suspects a trap. The evidence before him seems too incredible to accept at face value. An entire Austrian army appears to have destroyed itself without any Turkish intervention. Only after careful reconnaissance confirms the reality of the situation does he order his forces to advance and occupy Karansabes unopposed. Yusuf Pasha's dispatch to the Sultan provides insight into Ottoman strategic thinking in the face of such an unprecedented situation. "The Austrian forces have suffered a defeat so complete that we can hardly claim credit for it," he writes. "Their army has consumed itself in a single night of fratricidal violence. We advance not as conquerors, but as inheritors of a victory we did not earn." The irony is not lost on the Turkish commander. His forces had spent weeks preparing for a difficult siege, gathering siege equipment, positioning artillery, organizing assault columns. All of this preparation proves unnecessary when the Austrian garrison simply collapses without resistance. The fortress of Karansabes falls to the Ottomans not through Turkish military prowess but through Austrian self-destruction. The fall of the fortress represents more than a tactical defeat for the Austrian Empire. Karansabes had been a key strategic position, controlling important river crossings and supply routes. Its loss forces the Austrians to abandon their entire offensive campaign and retreat to more defensible positions. The Battle of Karansabes, fought entirely against themselves, has achieved what months of Ottoman resistance might not have accomplished. General von Hoditz, contemplating the strategic implications of the disaster, recognizes that the loss extends far beyond the immediate tactical situation. "The fall of Karansabes," he writes in his confidential report to Vienna, "represents the collapse of our entire Danubian strategy. Without this fortress, we cannot maintain our supply lines or protect our flanks. The campaign that was to have driven the Turks from the Balkans must now be abandoned." The strategic retreat that follows proves almost as devastating as the original battle. An army that had advanced with confidence and high morale now withdraws in confusion and despair. The knowledge that their defeat was self-inflicted makes the retreat particularly demoralizing, as soldiers struggle to understand how their professional competence could have failed so completely. The broader implications for Austrian military prestige prove equally damaging. Word of the disaster spreads throughout Europe, despite official efforts to suppress or minimize the story. Allied governments begin to question the reliability of Austrian military capabilities, while enemy powers draw encouragement from evidence of Habsburg weakness. The financial costs of the retreat compound the already enormous expenses of the failed campaign. Equipment abandoned during the withdrawal, supplies lost during the hasty evacuation, and the costs of establishing new defensive positions all add to the empire's mounting debts. The economic consequences of the Battle of Caransebes will be felt for years to come. As news of the disaster reaches Vienna, the imperial court struggles to comprehend the magnitude of the failure. Initial reports speak of a surprise Ottoman attack and heavy Austrian casualties, but the truth slowly emerges through the testimonies of survivors and the investigations of staff officers. The Emperor Joseph II, upon learning the full details, reportedly observes that his army has suffered a defeat more complete than any inflicted by the greatest of enemies. The Emperor's private correspondence reveals the personal impact of the disaster on the Habsburg leadership. How does one explain to the people that their army has been destroyed, not by enemy action but by its own confusion? Joseph writes to his brother Leopold, "The loss of life is tragic enough, but the loss of confidence in our military institutions may prove even more damaging to the monarchy's future." The imperial court's response reflects the broader challenge of managing public perception in the aftermath of military catastrophe. Official proclamations speak of valiant resistance against overwhelming Ottoman forces, while carefully omitting details about the true nature of the defeat. The narrative crafted for public consumption emphasizes Austrian courage and sacrifice, while minimizing the role of confusion and friendly fire. Court historians, tasked with recording the events for posterity, struggle with the challenge of presenting an account that serves both historical accuracy and dynastic propaganda. The result is a series of official histories that acknowledge the defeat while obscuring its most embarrassing details. These sanitized accounts will influence historical understanding of the battle for generations. The military bureaucracy, faced with the impossible task of explaining how a professional army could annihilate itself, begins a process of investigation and cover-up that will continue for decades. Official reports are carefully edited to minimize the appearance of incompetence. References to the battle in regimental histories are brief and euphemistic. The full truth of what happened at Caransebes becomes a closely guarded military secret, shared only among the highest levels of command. The institutional response reveals the Habsburg military establishment's deep concern about the implications of the disaster. If word spreads that Austrian armies can be defeated by their own confusion, the deterrent effect of Habsburg military power will be severely undermined. Potential enemies will be encouraged, allies will question Austrian reliability, and the entire structure of European balance of power could be destabilized. Colonel Franz von Colloredo, charged with conducting the official investigation, faces the delicate task of determining what went wrong without undermining confidence in military institutions. His report, classified at the highest levels, provides an honest assessment of the failures while recommending measures to prevent future occurrences. The Battle of Caransebes, Colloredo concludes, resulted from a cascade of communication failures, cultural misunderstandings, and command breakdowns that transformed a minor incident into a major catastrophe. While individual decisions were often rational, given available information, the cumulative effect was devastating. Future multinational operations must include improved language training, clearer identification procedures, and better coordination between diverse units. But even as Colloredo identifies the lessons to be learned, he recognizes the institutional barriers to implementing reform. The Austrian military system, based on centuries of tradition and established hierarchy, resists changes that might be interpreted as criticism of existing practices. The reforms that might prevent future disasters are diluted or delayed by bureaucratic inertia and institutional pride. The surviving officers and men, bound by military discipline and personal shame, largely maintain silence about their experiences. Those who do speak of the battle often find their accounts dismissed as impossible or exaggerated. The human tendency to reject narratives that seem too extraordinary to believe protects the reputation of the Austrian military establishment, but it also ensures that the lessons of Caransebes will not be learned or shared with future generations. Private Weber, the young Austrian whose confrontation with Hungarian cavalry had helped trigger the disaster, returns to his family farm in Lower Austria, carrying psychological wounds that will never fully heal. His attempts to explain his military experience to family and friends meet with incomprehension and disbelief. How can he make them understand that he participated in a battle where every enemy was really an ally, where every shot fired killed a fellow subject of the emperor? Weber's personal struggle with the memory of Karansabes reflects the broader challenge faced by survivors of the battle. The cognitive dissonance between their lived experience and the official narrative creates a form of trauma that has no recognized treatment or acknowledgement. These men carry their burden in silence, their sacrifice unrecognized, and their suffering unacknowledged. The letters and journals that survive from the period provide glimpses into the psychological aftermath of the battle. Sergeant Takags, recovering from his wounds in a military hospital, writes to his family about nightmares that persist months after the event. "I dream of charging into battle against Turkish cavalry," he confides, only to discover that I am fighting my own reflection in a mirror. I wake in terror, uncertain whether I can trust my own perceptions or judgments. Years pass before the true story begins to emerge in historical accounts, and even then, many details remain disputed or deliberately obscured. The Battle of Karansabes becomes a cautionary tale told in military academies, a study in the devastating consequences of poor communication and cultural misunderstanding. But for many historians, the event seems too bizarre to be entirely credible, leading to debates about the accuracy of various accounts that continue to this day. The historiographical challenges surrounding Karansabes reflect broader problems in military history. The tendency of official sources to minimize embarrassing failures, the unreliability of eyewitness testimony under extreme stress, and the human inclination to create coherent narratives from chaotic events, all contribute to uncertainty about what actually occurred. Modern historians, applying contemporary analytical methods to 18th century sources, have developed a more nuanced understanding of the battle. The work of scholars like Dr. Maria Tarnocci at the University of Vienna and Professor James Mitchell at Cambridge has revealed previously unknown documents and provided new insights into the social and cultural factors that contributed to the disaster. These modern analyses emphasize the role of linguistic confusion, cultural misunderstanding, and communication breakdown in transforming a minor incident into a major catastrophe. They also highlight the broader lessons about multinational military cooperation that remain relevant to contemporary peacekeeping and coalition operations. The legacy of Karansabes extends far beyond its immediate military consequences. The battle demonstrates how quickly professional competence can collapse under pressure, how cultural and linguistic differences can become deadly liabilities, and how fear can transform allies into enemies in the space of a heartbeat. These lessons, learned at such terrible cost, offer insights that remain relevant to military organizations facing the challenges of diversity and complexity in the modern world. Contemporary military analysts, studying the Battle of Karansabes, identify several critical factors that contributed to the disaster. The absence of effective communication protocols between different linguistic groups created conditions where misunderstanding could escalate rapidly. The lack of clear identification procedures in darkness made it impossible to distinguish friend from foe. The decentralized command structure meant that local incidents could spiral out of control before higher authorities could intervene. These factors, while specific to the 18th century Habsburg context, have parallels in modern multinational operations. NATO forces in Afghanistan, United Nations peacekeepers in Africa, and coalition forces in Iraq have all faced similar challenges in coordinating diverse military units under stressful conditions. The lessons of Karansabes, properly understood, offer valuable insights for contemporary military planners. The battle also highlights the critical importance of cultural competence in military leadership. Officers commanding multinational forces must understand not only the tactical capabilities of their subordinate units, but also their cultural backgrounds, linguistic limitations, and historical experiences. The failure to appreciate these factors can transform diversity from a strength into a vulnerability. As you contemplate this extraordinary chapter in military history, consider how the comfortable certainties of daily life can dissolve so quickly when fear takes hold. The Austrian soldiers who destroyed their own army were not cowards or incompetents. They were professional military men responding to incomplete information under extreme stress. Their tragedy reminds us that even the most sophisticated human institutions remain vulnerable to the fundamental weaknesses of human nature. The Battle of Karansabes raises profound questions about the nature of reality and perception under stress. If trained soldiers, operating within familiar institutional frameworks, can so completely misinterpret their situation. What does this suggest about human cognitive limitations? How can any individual or organization be confident in their perceptions when the stakes are highest and the pressure most intense? The epistemological implications extend beyond military affairs to broader questions about knowledge, certainty, and judgment. The Austrian soldiers at Caransebes possessed accurate information about their situation. They knew their own identity, their mission, their location, their allies. Yet this knowledge proved useless when filtered through fear, confusion, and cultural misunderstanding. The battle also illuminates the social construction of reality under extreme conditions. The truth of Ottoman infiltration, while factually incorrect, became operationally real for the soldiers who believed it. Their actions, based on this false belief, created consequences that were tragically authentic. The power of collective belief to shape reality, even when that belief is fundamentally mistaken, emerges as a central theme of the Caransebes story. The psychological mechanisms that drove the disaster at Caransebes remain active in contemporary contexts. The speed with which misinformation can spread through digital networks, the tendency for fear to override rational analysis in crisis situations, and the challenge of maintaining accurate perception under stress, all have modern parallels. The COVID-19 pandemic, for example, demonstrated how quickly fear and misinformation can spread through global communication networks, creating panic that sometimes proved more damaging than the original threat. The financial crisis of 2008 showed how institutional trust can collapse when fundamental assumptions about system reliability are called into question. Political polarization in democratic societies illustrates how different groups can interpret identical information in completely contradictory ways. These contemporary parallels suggest that the lessons of Caransebes extend far beyond military affairs. Any complex organization operating under stress faces similar challenges in maintaining accurate communication, preserving institutional trust, and preventing fear from overwhelming rational decision-making. The specific mechanisms may have evolved, but the underlying human vulnerabilities remain constant. The sun climbs higher over the battlefield of Caransebes, its warmth beginning to dispel the morning mist. The physical evidence of the disaster will eventually be cleared away, the dead buried, the wounded healed, but the memory of this night will linger in the collective consciousness of the Austrian military, a reminder of how quickly order can become chaos, how easily friends can become enemies, and how the greatest defeats sometimes come, not from external foes, but from the failures within ourselves. In the quiet of your own evening, safe in the knowledge that the dangers faced by those 18th century soldiers remain safely in the past, you can reflect on their experience with the detached wisdom that historical distance provides. The Battle of Caransebes, for all its tragedy, offers a fascinating glimpse into the complexities of human nature under stress. Yet perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Caransebes story is not its historical distance, but its contemporary relevance. The same cognitive limitations, cultural blind spots, and institutional vulnerabilities that destroyed the Austrian army in 1788 remain present in modern organizations and societies. The comfortable assumption that such a catastrophic failure of perception and communication could not occur in our more sophisticated age may itself reflect the kind of overconfidence that made Caransebes possible. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps you can find comfort in the contrast between their chaotic night and your own peaceful rest, grateful for the simple blessing of clarity that daylight and distance provide. But let the memory of those Austrian soldiers serve as a reminder that the line between order and chaos, between friend and enemy, between reality and illusion, remains thinner than we might wish to believe. The Battle of Caransebes stands as an eternal warning about the fragility of human institutions and the devastating power of fear to transform the familiar into the threatening. In our own age of global communication, multinational cooperation, and complex organizational structures, the lessons of that September night in 1788 remain as relevant as ever. The greatest enemies we face may not be those who oppose us from without, but those we create from within, through our own failures of understanding, communication, and trust.